File 11.
Chapter 11. "Come in," says the woman, and I did. She says, "Take a chair." I done it. She looked me all over with her little shiny eyes and says, "What might your name be?" "Sarah Williams." "Whereabouts do you live, in this neighborhood?" "No, in Huckleberry, 7 miles below. I've walked all the way and I'm all tired out." "Hungry too, I reckon. I'll find you something." "No, I ain't hungry. I was so hungry I had to stop 2 miles below here at a farm, so I ain't hungry no more. It's what makes me so late. My mother's down sick and out of money and everything, and I come to tell my Uncle Abner more. He lives at the upper end of the town, she says. I hain't ever been here before. Do you know him?" "No, but I don't know everybody yet. I haven't lived here quite 2 weeks. It's a considerable ways to the upper end of the town. You better stay here all night. Take off your bonnet." "No," I says. "I'll rest a while, I reckon, and go on. I ain't afeard of the dark." She said she wouldn't let me go by myself, but her husband would be in by and by, maybe in an hour and a half, and she'd send him along with me. Then she got to talking about her husband and about her relations up the river, and her relations down the river, and about how much better off they used to was, and how they didn't know but they'd made a mistake coming to our town instead of letting well alone, and so on, till I was afeard I had made a mistake coming to her to find out what was going on in the town. But by and by she dropped on to Pap and the murder, and then I was pretty willing to let her clatter right along. She told about me and Tom Sawyer finding the $6,000, only she got it 10, and all about Pap and what a hard lot he was, and what a hard lot I was, and at last she got down to where I was murdered. I says, "Who done it? We've heard considerable about these goings-on down in Hookerville, but we don't know who 'twas that killed Huck Finn." "Well, I reckon there's a right smart chance of people here that'd like to know who killed him. Some think old Finn done it himself." "No, is that so?" "Most everybody thought it at first. He'll never know how nigh he come to getting lynched. But before night they changed around and judged it was done by a runaway nigger named Jim." "Why, I stopped. I reckon I better keep still. She run on and never noticed I had put in at all. "The nigger run off the very night Huck Finn was killed. So there's a reward out for him, $300, and there's a reward out for old Finn, too, $200. You see, he come to town the morning after the murder and told about it, and was out with them on the ferry boat hunt, and right away after he up and left. Before night they wanted to lynch him, but he was gone, you see. Well, next day they found out the nigger was gone. They found out he hadn't been seen since 10 o'clock the night the murder was done. So they put in on him, you see, and while they was full of it, next day back comes old Finn and went boo-hooing to Judge Thatcher to get money to hunt for the nigger all over Illinois with. The judge gave him some, and that evening he got drunk and was around till after midnight with a couple of mighty hard-looking strangers, and then went off with them. Well, he ain't come back since, and they ain't looking for him back till this thing blows over a little, for people thinks now that he killed his boy and fixed things so folks would think Roberts done it, and then he'd get Huck's money without having to bother a long time with a lawsuit. People do say he warn't any too good to do it. Oh, he's sly, I reckon. If he don't come back for a year, he'll be all right. You can't prove anything on him, you know. Everything will be quieted down then, and he'll walk in Huck's money as easy as nothing." "Yes, I reckon so. I don't see nothing in the way of it. Has everybody quit thinking the nigger done it?" "Oh, no, not everybody. A good many thinks he done it. But they'll get the nigger pretty soon now, and maybe they can scare it out of him." "Why, are they after him yet?" "Well, you're innocent, ain't you? Does $300 lay around every day for people to pick up? Some folks think the nigger ain't far from here. I'm one of 'em, but I hain't talked it around. A few days ago I was talking with an old couple that lives next door in the log shanty, and they happened to say hardly anybody ever goes to that island over yonder that they call Jackson's Island. Don't anybody live there? Says I. No, nobody, says they. I didn't say any more, but I done some thinking. I was pretty near certain I'd seen smoke over there about the head of the island a day or two before that. So I says to myself, like as not that nigger's hiding over there. Anyway, says I, it's worth the trouble to give the place a hunt. I hain't seen any smoke since, so I reckon maybe he's gone, if it was him. But husband's going over to sea, him and another man. He was gone up the river, but he got back today, and I told him as soon as he got here 2 hours ago. I had got so uneasy I couldn't set still. I had to do something with my hands, so I took up a needle off the table and went to threading it. My hands shook, and I was making a bad job of it. When the woman stopped talking, I looked up, and she was looking at me pretty curious and smiling a little. I put down the needle and thread and let on to be interested, and I was too, and says, $300 is a power of money. I wish my mother could get it. Is your husband going over there tonight? Oh, yes. He went uptown with the man I was telling you of to get a boat and see if they could borrow another gun. They'll go after midnight. Couldn't they see better if they was to wait till daytime? Yes, and couldn't the nigger see better too? After midnight he'll likely be asleep, and they can slip around through the woods and hunt up his campfire all the better for the dark, if he's got one. I didn't think of that. The woman kept looking at me pretty curious, and I didn't feel a bit comfortable. Pretty soon she says, What did you say your name was, honey? Mary Williams. Somehow it didn't seem to me that I said it was Mary before, so I didn't look up. Seemed to me like I said it was Sarah, so I felt sort of cornered, and was afeard maybe I was looking it too. I wished the woman would say something more. The longer she sat still, the uneasier I was. But now she says, Honey, I thought you said it was Sarah when you first come in. Oh, yes'm, I did. Sarah Mary Williams. Sarah's my first name. Some calls me Sarah, some calls me Mary. Oh, that's the way of it. Yes'm. I was feeling better then, but I wished I was out of there anyway. I couldn't look up yet. Well, the woman fell to talking about how hard times was, and how poor they had to live, and how the rats was as free as if they owned the place, and so forth and so on. And then I got easy again. She was right about the rats. You'd see one stick his nose out of a hole in the corner every little while. She said she had to have things handy to throw at them when she was alone, or they wouldn't give her no peace. She showed me a bar of lead twisted up into a knot, and she said she was a good shot with it generally, but she'd wrenched her arm a day or two ago and didn't know whether she could throw true now. But she watched for a chance and directly banged away at a rat. But she missed him wide and said, Ouch! It hurt her arm so. Then she told me to try for the next one. I wanted to be getting away before the old man got back, but of course I didn't let on. I got the thing, and the first rat that showed his nose I let drive, and if he'd have stayed where he was, he'd have been a tolerable sick rat. She said that was first rate, and she reckoned I would hive the next one. She went and got the lump of lead and fetched it back and brought along a hank of yarn, which she wanted me to help her with. I held up my 2 hands, and she put the hank over them, and went on talking about her and her husband's matters. But she broke off to say, Keep your eye on the rats. You better have the lead in your lap handy. So she dropped the lump into my lap just at that moment, and I clapped my legs together on it, and she went on talking. But only about a minute. Then she took off the hank and looked me straight in the face, and very pleasant, and says, Come now, what's your real name? What, Mom? What's your real name? Is it Bill or Tom or Bob? What is it? I reckon I shook like a leaf, and I didn't know hardly what to do, but I says, Please don't poke fun at a poor girl like me, Mum. If I'm in the way here, I'll... No, you won't. Set down and stay where you are. I ain't going to hurt you, and I ain't going to tell on you nuther. You just tell me your secret and trust me. I'll keep it, and what's more, I'll help you. So will my old man if you want him to. You see, you're a runaway prentice, that's all. It ain't nothing. There ain't no harm in it. You've been treated bad, and you made up your mind to cut. Bless you, child, I wouldn't tell on you. Tell me all about it now, that's a good boy. So I said it wouldn't be no use to try to play it any longer, and I would just make a clean breast and tell her everything, but she mustn't go back on her promise. Then I told her my father and mother was dead, and the law had bound me out to a mean old farmer in the country 30 miles back from the river, and he treated me so bad I couldn't stand it no longer. He went away to be gone a couple of days, and so I took my chance and stole some of his daughter's clothes and cleared out. And I had been 3 nights coming the 30 miles. I traveled nights and hid daytimes and slept, and the bag of bread and meat I carried from home lasted me all the way, and I had a plenty. I said I believed my Uncle Abner Moore would take care of me, and so that was why I struck out for this town of Goshen. Goshen, child? This ain't Goshen, this is St. Petersburg. Goshen's 10 miles further up the river. Who told you this was Goshen? Why, man, I met at daybreak this morning, just as I was going to turn into the woods for my regular sleep. He told me when the roads forked I must take the right hand, and 5 miles would fetch me to Goshen. He was drunk, I reckon. He told you just exactly wrong. Well, he did act like he was drunk, but it ain't no matter now. I got to be moving along. I'll fetch Goshen before daylight. Hold on a minute. I'll put you up a snack to eat. You might want it. So she put me up a snack and says, Say, when a cow's laying down, which end of her gets up first? Answer up prompt now. Don't start to study it over. Which end gets up first? The hind end, Mum. Well, then a horse? Oh, the forward end, Mum. Which side of a tree does the moss grow on? North side. If 15 cows is browsing on the hillside, how many of them eats with their heads pointed the same direction? Well, the whole 15, Mum. Well, I reckon you have lived in the country. I thought maybe you was trying to hocus me again. What's your real name now? George Peters, Mum. Well, try to remember it, George. Don't forget and tell me it's Alexander before you go, and then go out by saying it's George Alexander when I catch you. And don't go about women in that old calico. You do a girl tolerable poor, but you might fool men, maybe. Bless you, child, when you set out to thread a needle, don't hold the thread still and fetch the needle up to it. Hold the needle still and poke the thread at it. That's the way a woman most always does, but a man always does t'other way. And when you throw at a rat or anything, hitch yourself up a tiptoe and fetch your hand up over your head as awkward as you can, and miss your rat about 6 or 7 foot. Throw stiff arm from the shoulder like there was a pivot there for it to turn on, like a girl, not from the wrist and elbow with your arm out to one side like a boy. And mind you, when a girl tries to catch anything in her lap, she throws her knees apart. She don't clap them together the way you did when you catched a lump of lead. Why, I spotted you for a boy when you was threading a needle, and I contrived the other things just to make certain. Now trot along to your uncle, Sarah Mary Williams, George Alexander Peters. And if you get into trouble, you send word to Miss Judith Loftus, which is me, and I'll do what I can to get you out of it. Keep the river road all the way, and next time you tramp, take shoes and socks with you. The river road's a rocky one, and your feet'll be in a condition when you get to Goshen, I reckon. I went up the bank about 50 yards, and then I doubled on my tracks and slipped back to where my canoe was, a good piece below the house. I jumped in and was off in a hurry. I went upstream far enough to make the head of the island, and then started across. I took off the sunbonnet, for I didn't want no blinders on then. When I was about the middle, I heard the clock begin to strike, so I stops and listens. The sound came faint over the water, but clear. 11. When I struck the head of the island, I never waited to blow, though I was most winded, but I shoved right into the timber where my old camp used to be and started a good fire there on a high and dry spot. Then I jumped in the canoe and dug out for our place, a mile and a half below, as hard as I could go. I landed and slopped through the timber and up the ridge and into the cavern. There Jim laid, sound asleep on the ground. I roused him out and says, "Get up and hump yourself, Jim. There ain't a minute to lose. They're after us." Jim never asked no questions. He never said a word, but the way he worked for the next half an hour showed about how he was scared. By that time, everything we had in the world was on our raft, and she was ready to be shoved out from the willow cove where she was hid. We put out the campfire at the cavern the first thing, and didn't show a candle outside after that. I took the canoe out from the shore a little piece and took a look. But if there was a boat around, I couldn't see it, for stars and shadows ain't good to see by. Then we got out the raft and slipped along down in the shade, past the foot of the island, dead still, never saying a word.
File 12.
Chapter 12. It must have been close on to 1 o'clock when we got below the island at last, and the raft did seem to go mighty slow. If a boat was to come along, we was going to take the canoe and break for the Illinois shore, and it was well a boat didn't come, for we hadn't ever thought to put the gun in the canoe or a fishing line or anything to eat. We was in rather too much of a sweat to think of so many things. It warn't good judgment to put everything on the raft. If the men went to the island, I just expect they found the campfire I built and watched it all night for Jim to come. Anyways, they stayed away from us, and if my building the fire never fooled them, it warn't no fault of mine. I played it as low down on them as I could. When the first streak of day began to show, we tied up to a towhead in a big bend on the Illinois side, and hacked off cottonwood branches with a hatchet, and covered up the raft with them so she looked like there had been a cave-in in the bank there. A towhead is a sandbar that has cottonwoods on it as thick as harrow teeth. We had mountains on the Missouri shore and heavy timber on the Illinois side, and the channel was down at the Missouri shore at that place, so we weren't afraid of anybody running across us. We laid there all day and watched the rafts and steamboats spin down the Missouri shore, and upbound steamboats fight the big river in the middle. I told Jim all about the time I had jabbering with that woman, and Jim said she was a smart one, and if she was to start after us herself, she wouldn't set down and watch a campfire. No, sir, she'd fetch a dog. Well, then, I said, why couldn't she tell her husband to fetch a dog? Jim said he bet she did think of it by the time the men was ready to start, and he believed they must have gone uptown to get a dog, and so they lost all that time, or else we wouldn't be here on a towhead 16 or 17 miles below the village. No, indeedy, we would be in that same old town again. So I said I didn't care what was the reason they didn't get us as long as they didn't. When it was beginning to come on dark, we poked our heads out of the cottonwood thicket and looked up and down and across. Nothing in sight. So Jim took up some of the top planks of the raft and built a snug wigwam to get under in blazing weather and rainy, and to keep the things dry. Jim made a floor for the wigwam and raised it a foot or more above the level of the raft, so now the blankets and all the traps was out of reach of steamboat waves. Right in the middle of the wigwam we made a layer of dirt about 5 or 6 inches deep with a frame around it for to hold it to its place. This was to build a fire on in sloppy weather or chilly. The wigwam would keep it from being seen. We made an extra steering oar too, because one of the others might get broke or a snag or something. We fixed up a short forked stick to hang the old lantern on, because we must always light the lantern whenever we see a steamboat coming downstream to keep from getting run over. But we wouldn't have to light it for upstream boats unless we see we was in what they call a crossing, for the river was pretty high yet, very low banks being still a little under water, so upbound boats didn't always run the channel but hunted easy water. This second night we run between 7 and 8 hours with a current that was making over 4 miles an hour. We catched fish and talked, and we took a swim now and then to keep off sleepiness. It was kind of solemn, drifting down the big, still river, laying on our backs looking up at the stars. And we didn't ever feel like talking loud, and it warn't often that we laughed. Only a little kind of a low chuckle. We had mighty good weather as a general thing, and nothing ever happened to us at all, that night, nor the next, nor the next. Every night we passed towns, some of them away up on black hillsides, nothing but just a shiny bed of lights, not a house you could see. The fifth night we passed St. Louis, and it was like the whole world lit up. In St. Petersburg they used to say there was 20 or 30,000 people in St. Louis, but I never believed it till I see that wonderful spread of lights at 2 o'clock that still night. There warn't a sound there, everybody was asleep. Every night now I used to slip ashore towards 10 o'clock at some little village and buy 10 or 15 cents worth of meal or bacon or other stuff to eat. And sometimes I lifted a chicken that warn't roosting comfortable and took him along. Pap always said, take a chicken when you get a chance, because if you don't want 'em yourself, you can easy find somebody that does, and a good deed ain't ever forgot. I never see Pap when he didn't want the chicken himself, but that is what he used to say anyway. Mornings before daylight I slipped into cornfields and borrowed a watermelon or a mushmelon or a pumpkin or some new corn or things of that kind. Pap always said it warn't no harm to borrow things if you was meaning to pay them back sometime. But the widow said it warn't anything but a soft name for stealing, and no decent body would do it. Jim said he reckoned the widow was partly right and Pap was partly right, so the best way would be for us to pick out 2 or 3 things from the list and say we wouldn't borrow them any more. Then he reckoned it wouldn't be no harm to borrow the others. So we talked it over all one night, drifting along down the river, trying to make up our minds whether to drop the watermelons or the cantaloupes or the mushmelons or what. But towards daylight we got it all settled satisfactory, and concluded to drop crab apples and persimmons. We weren't feeling just right before that, but it was all comfortable now. I was glad the way it come out, too, because crab apples ain't ever good, and the persimmons wouldn't be ripe for 2 or 3 months yet. We shot a waterfowl now and then that got up too early in the morning or didn't go to bed early enough in the evening. Take it all round, we lived pretty high. The fifth night below St. Louis we had a big storm after midnight, with a power of thunder and lightning, and the rain poured down in a solid sheet. We stayed in the wigwam and let the raft take care of itself. When the lightning glared out, we could see a big straight river ahead and high rocky bluffs on both sides. By and by, says I, "Hello, Jim, looky yonder." It was a steamboat that had killed herself on a rock. We was drifting straight down for her. The light showed her very distinct. She was leaning over with part of her upper deck above water, and you could see every little chimney guy clean and clear, and a chair by the big bell with an old slouch hat hanging on the back of it, when the flashes come. Well, it being away in the night and stormy and all so mysterious-like, I felt just the way any other boy would have felt when I see that wreck laying there so mournful and lonesome in the middle of the river. I wanted to get aboard of her and slink around a little and see what there was there. So I says, "Let's land on her, Jim." But Jim was dead against it at first. He says, "I don't want to go fooling long in no wreck. We's doing blame well, and we better let blame well alone, so the good book says. Like as not, dey's a watchman on that wreck." "Watchman, your grandmother," I says. "There ain't nothing to watch but the Texas and the pilot house. And do you reckon anybody's going to risk his life for a Texas and a pilot house such a night as this, when it's likely to break up and wash off down the river any minute?" Jim couldn't say nothing to that, so he didn't try. "And besides," I says, "we might borrow something worth having out of the captain's stateroom. Cigars, I betcha, and cost 5 cents apiece, solid cash. Steamboat captains is always rich and get $60 a month, and they don't care a cent what a thing costs, you know, long as they want it. Stick a candle in your pocket. I can't rest, Jim, till we give her a rummaging. Do you reckon Tom Sawyer would ever go by this thing? Not for pie, he wouldn't. He'd call it an adventure, that's what he'd call it, and he'd land on that wreck if it was his last act. And wouldn't he throw style into it? Wouldn't he spread himself nor nothing? Why, you'd think it was Christopher Columbus discovering kingdom come. I wish Tom Sawyer was here. Jim grumbled a little, but give in. He said we mustn't talk any more than we could help, and then talk mighty low. The lightning showed us the wreck again just in time, and we fetched the starboard derrick and made fast there. The deck was high out here. We went sneaking down the slope of it to larboard in the darkness toward the Texas, feeling our way slow with our feet, and spreading our hands out to fend off the guys, for it was so dark we couldn't see no sign of them. Pretty soon we struck the forward end of the skylight and clumb onto it, and the next step fetched us in front of the captain's door, which was open, and by Jiminy, away down through the Texas hall we see a light, and all in the same second we seemed to hear low voices in yonder. Jim whispered and said he was feeling powerful sick and told me to come along. I says all right and was going to start for the raft, but just then I heard a voice wail out and say, "Oh, please don't, boys. I swear I won't ever tell." Another voice said pretty loud, "It's a lie, Jim Turner. You acted this way before. You always want more than your share of the truck, and you always got it too because you swore it if you didn't you'd tell. But this time you said it just one time too many. You're the meanest, treacherousest hound in this country." By this time Jim was gone for the raft. I was just a-biling with curiosity, and I says to myself, Tom Sawyer wouldn't back out now, and so I won't either. I'm a-going to see what's going on here. So I dropped on my hands and knees in the little passage, and crept aft in the dark till there warn't but one stateroom betwixt me and the cross hall of the Texas. Then in there I see a man stretched on the floor and tied hand and foot, and two men standing over him, and one of them had a dim lantern in his hand, and the other one had a pistol. This one kept pointing the pistol at the man's head on the floor and saying, "I'd like to, and I orter to, a mean skunk." The man on the floor would shrivel up and say, "Oh, please don't, Bill. I ain't ever going to tell." And every time he said that, the man with the lantern would laugh and say, "'Deed you ain't. You never said no truer thing than that, you betcha." And once he said, "Hear him beg, and yet if we hadn't got the best of him and tied him, he'd have killed us both. And what for? Just for nothing. Just because we stood on our rights, that's what for. But I lay you ain't a-going to threaten nobody any more, Jim Turner. Put up that pistol, Bill." Bill says, "I don't want to, Jake Packard. I'm for killing him, and didn't he kill old Hatfield just the same way, and don't he deserve it? But I don't want him killed, and I got my reasons for it." "Bless your heart for them words, Jake Packard. I'll never forget you as long as I live," says the man on the floor, sort of blubbering. Packard didn't take no notice of that, but hung up his lantern on a nail and started towards where I was in the dark, and motioned Bill to come. I crawfished as fast as I could about 2 yards, but the boat slanted so I couldn't make very good time. So to keep from getting run over and catched, I crawled into a stateroom on the upper side. The man came a-pawing along in the dark, and when Packard got to my stateroom, he says, "Here, come in here." And in he come, and Bill after him, but before they got in, I was up in the upper berth, cornered, and sorry I came. Then they stood there with their hands on the ledge of the berth and talked. I couldn't see them, but I could tell where they was by the whiskey they'd been having. I was glad I didn't drink whiskey, but it wouldn't have made much difference anyway, because most of the time they couldn't have treated me because I didn't breathe. I was too scared. And besides, a body couldn't breathe and hear such talk. They talked low and earnest. Bill wanted to kill Turner. He says he'll tell, and he will. If we was to give both our shares to him now, it wouldn't make no difference after the row and the way we served him. Sure as you're born, he'll turn state's evidence. Now you hear me. I'm for putting him out of his troubles." "So am I," says Packard, very quiet. "Blame it, I'd sort of begun to think you wasn't. Well then, that's all right. Let's go and do it." "Hold on a minute. I hain't had my say yet. You listen to me. Shooting's good, but there's quieter ways if the thing's got to be done. But what I say is this, it ain't good sense to go courting around after a halter if you can get at what you're up to in some way that's just as good and at the same time don't bring you into no risks. Ain't that so?" "You bet it is, but how you going to manage it this time?" Well, my idea is this. We'll rustle around and gather up whatever pickings we overlooked in the staterooms, and shove for shore and hide the truck. Then we'll wait. Now, I say it ain't going to be more than 2 hours before this wreck breaks up and washes off down the river, see? He'll be drownded and won't have nobody to blame for it but his own self. I reckon that's a considerable sight better than killing of him. I'm unfavorable to killing a man as long as you can get around it. Ain't good sense, it ain't good morals, ain't I right? Yes, I reckon you are. But suppose she don't break up and wash off. Well, we can wait the 2 hours anyway and see, can't we? All right then, come along. So they started, and I lit out, all in a cold sweat, and scrambled forward. It was dark as pitch there, but I said in a kind of a coarse whisper, "Jim!" And he answered up right at my elbow with a sort of a moan, and I says, "Quit, Jim, it ain't no time for fooling around and moaning. There's a gang of murderers in yonder, and if we don't hunt up their boat and set her drifting down the river so these fellas can't get away from the wreck, there's one of 'em going to be in a bad fix. But if we find their boat, we can put all of 'em in a bad fix, for the sheriff will get 'em. Quick, hurry, I'll hunt the larboard side, you hunt the starboard. You start at the raft and—" "Oh, my lordy, lordy, raft! They ain't no raft no more. She done broke loose and gone, and here we is."
File 13.
Chapter 13. Well, I catched my breath and most fainted. Shut up on a wreck with such a gang as that. But it warn't no time to be sentimentalin'. We'd got to find that boat now, had to have it for ourselves. So we went a-quakin' and shakin' down the starboard side, and slow work it was, too. Seemed a week before we got to the stern. No sign of a boat. Jim said he didn't believe he could go any further. So scared he hadn't hardly any strength left, he said. But I said, come on, if we get left on this wreck, we're in a fix, sure. So on we prowled again. We struck for the stern of the Texas and found it, and then scrabbled along forwards on the skylight, hanging from shutter to shutter, for the edge of the skylight was in the water. When we got pretty close to the cross-haul door, there was the skiff, sure enough. I could just barely see her. I felt ever so thankful. In another second I would have been aboard of her, but just then the door opened. One of the men stuck his head out only about a couple of foot from me, and I thought I was gone, but he jerked it in again and says, "Heave that blame lantern out of sight, Bill." He flung a bag of something into the boat and then got in himself and sat down. It was Packard. Then Bill, he come out and got in. Packard says in a low voice, "All right, shove off." I couldn't hardly hang on to the shutters, I was so weak, but Bill says, "Hold on. You go through him?" "Naw, didn't you?" "Nah, so he's got his share of the cash yet." "Well, then, come along. No use to take truck and leave money." "Say, won't he suspicion what we're up to?" "Maybe he won't, but we got to have it anyway. Come along." So they got out and went in. The door slammed to because it was on the careen side, and in half a second I was in the boat and Jim come tumbling after me. I out with my knife and cut the rope, and away we went. We didn't touch an oar, and we didn't speak nor whisper, nor hardly even breathe. We went gliding swift along, dead silent, past the tip of the paddle box and past the stern. Then in a second or two more we was 100 yards below the wreck, and the darkness soaked her up, every last sign of her, and we was safe and knowed it. When we was 300 or 400 yards downstream, we see the lantern show like a little spark at the Texas door for a second, and we knowed by that the rascals had missed their boat and was beginning to understand that they was in just as much trouble now as Jim Turner was. Then Jim manned the oars, and we took out after our raft. Now was the first time that I begun to worry about the men. I reckon I hadn't the time to before. I begun to think how dreadful it was, even for murderers, to be in such a fix. I says to myself, there ain't no telling but I might come to be a murderer myself yet, and then how would I like it? So I says to Jim, the first light we see we'll land 100 yards below it or above it, in a place where it's a good hiding place for you and the skiff, and then I'll go and fix up some kind of a yarn and get somebody to go for that gang and get them out of their scrape, so they can be hung when their time comes. But that idea was a failure, for pretty soon it begun to storm again, and this time worse than ever. The rain poured down, and never a light showed, everybody in bed, I reckon. We boomed along down the river, watching for lights and watching for our raft. After a long time the rain let up, but the clouds stayed, and the lightning kept whimpering, and by a flash showed us a black thing ahead, floating, and we made for it. It was the raft, and mighty glad was we to get aboard of it again. We seen a light now away down to the right, on shore, so I said I would go for it. The skiff was half full of plunder which that gang had stole there on the wreck. We hustled it onto the raft in a pile, and I told Jim to float along down and show a light when he had judged he has gone about 2 mile, and keep it burning till I come. Then I manned my oars and shoved for the light. As I got down towards it, 3 or 4 more showed, up on a hillside. It was a village. I closed in above the shore light and laid on my oars and floated. As I went by, I see it was a lantern hanging on the jack-skiff of a double-hulled ferry boat. I skimmed around for the watchman, a-wondering whereabouts he slept, and by I found him roosting on the bitts forward, with his head down between his knees. I gave his shoulder 2 or 3 little shoves and begun to cry. He stirred up in a kind of startlish way, but when he see it was only me, he took a good gap and stretched, and then he says, "Hello, what's up? Don't cry, bub, what's the trouble?" I says, "Pap and Mam and Sis and—" Then I broke down. He says, "Aw, dang it now, don't take on so. We all has to have our troubles, and this'll come out all right. What's the matter with them?" There, are you the watchman of the boat?" "Yes," he says, kind of pretty well satisfied like. "I'm the captain and the owner and the mate and the pilot and watchman and head deckhand, and sometimes I'm the freight and passengers. I ain't as rich as old Jim Hornback, and I can't be so blamed generous and good to Tom, Dick, and Harry as what he is, and slam around money the way he does. But I've told him many a time I wouldn't trade places with him, for says I, a sailor's life's the life for me, and I'll be durned if I'd live 2 mile out of town where there ain't nothing ever going on, not for all his spooned ducks and as many more on top of it, says I. I broke in and says, "They're in an awful peck of trouble, and—" "Who is?" "Why, Pap and Mam and Sis and Miss Hooker, and if you take your ferry boat and go up there—" "Up where? Where are they?" "On the wreck." "What wreck?" "Why, there ain't but one." "What, you don't mean the Walter Scott?" "Yes." "Good land, what are they doing there, for gracious sakes?" "Well, they didn't go there a purpose." "I'll bet they didn't. Why, great goodness, there ain't no chance for 'em if they don't get off mighty quick. Why, how in the nation did they ever get into such a scrape?" "Easy enough. Miss Hooker was a-visitin' up there to the town." "Yes, Booth's Landing. Go on." "She was a-visitin' there at Booth's Landing, and just on the edge of evening she started over with her nigger woman in a horse ferry to stay all night at her friend's house. Miss Whatchamacaller, I disremember her name. And they lost their steering oar and swung around and went a-floatin' down stern first about 2 mile, and saddlebagged on the wreck, and the ferryman and the nigger woman and the horses was all lost, but Miss Hooker she made a grab and got aboard the wreck. Well, about an hour after dark we come along down in our trading scow, and it was so dark we didn't notice the wreck till we was right on it, and so we saddlebagged, but all of us was saved but Bill Whipple. And oh, he was the best creature. I most wished it had been me, I do." "My George, it's the beatin'est thing I ever struck. And then what did you all do?" "Well, we hollered and took on, but it's so wide that we couldn't make nobody hear. So Pap said somebody got to get ashore and get help somehow. I was the only one that could swim, so I made a dash for it. And Miss Hooker, she said if I didn't strike help sooner, come here and hunt up her uncle, and he'd fix the thing. I made the land about a mile below and been fooling along ever since trying to get people to do something, but they said, "What, in such a night and such a current? There ain't no sense in it. Go for the steam ferry." Now if you're going, "By Jackson, I'd like to, and blame it, I don't know, but I will. But who in the dignation's a going to pay for it? Do you reckon your pap?" "Why, that's all right. Miss Hooker, she told me particular that her Uncle Hornback—" "Great guns, is he her uncle? Looky here, you break for that light over yonder way and turn out west when you get there, and about a quarter of a mile out you'll come to the tavern. Tell him to dart you out to Jim Hornback's and he'll foot the bill, and don't you fool around any because he'll want to know the news. Tell him I have his niece all safe before he can get to town. Hump yourself now, I'm a-going up around the corner here to roust out my engineer." I struck for the light, but as soon as he turned the corner I went back and got into my skiff and bailed her out, and then pulled up shore in the easy water about 600 yards, and tucked myself in among some wood boats, for I couldn't rest easy till I could see the ferry boat start. But take it all around, I was feeling rather comfortable on accounts of taking all this trouble for that gang, for not many would have done it. I wish the widow knowed about it. I judged she would be proud of me for helping these rapscallions, because rapscallions and deadbeats is the kind the widow and good people takes the most interest in. Well, before long, here comes the wreck, dim and dusky, sliding along down. A kind of cold shiver went through me, and then I struck out for her. She was very deep, and I see in a minute there warn't much chance for anybody being alive in her. I pulled all around her and hollered a little, but there wasn't any answer, all dead still. I felt a little bit heavy-hearted about the gang, but not much, for I reckoned if they could stand it, I could. Then here comes the ferry boat, so I shoved for the middle of the river on a long downstream slant, and when I judged I was out of eye reach, I laid on my oars and looked back and see her go and smell around the wreck for Miss Hooker's remainders, because the captain would know her Uncle Hornback would want them, and then pretty soon the ferry boat give it up and went for the shore, and I laid into my work and went a-booming down the river. It did seem a powerful long time before Jim's light showed up, and when it did show it looked like it was 1,000 miles off. By the time I got there the sky was beginning to get a little gray in the east, so we struck for an island and hid the raft and sunk the skiff and turned in and slept like dead people.
File 14.
Chapter 14. By and by, when we got up, we turned over the truck the gang had stole off of the wreck, and found boots and blankets and clothes and all sorts of other things, and a lot of books, and a spyglass, and 3 boxes of cigars. We hadn't ever been this rich before in neither of our lives. The cigars was prime. We laid off all the afternoon in the woods talking, and me reading the books, and having a general good time. I told Jim all about what happened inside the wreck and at the ferry boat, and I said these kinds of things was adventures, but he said he didn't want no more adventures. He said that when I went in the Texas and he crawled back to get on the raft and found her gone, he nearly died, because he judged it was all up with him any way it could be fixed, for if he didn't get saved he would get drowned, and if he did get saved, whoever saved him would send him back home so as to get the reward, and then Miss Watson would sell him south sure. Well, he was right. He was most always right. He had an uncommon level head for a nigger. I read considerable to Jim about kings and dukes and earls and such, and how gaudy they dressed and how much style they put on, and called each other your majesty and your grace and your lordship and so on, instead of mister, and Jim's eyes bugged out, and he was interested. He says, "I didn't know dey was so many of 'em. I hain't heard 'bout none of 'em, scarcely, but old King Solomon, unless you counts dem kings that's in a pack of cards. How much do a king get?" "Get?" I says. "Why, they get $1,000 a month if they want it. They can have just as much as they want. Everything belongs to them. Ain't that gay? And what do they got to do, Huck? They don't got to do nothing. Why, how you talk. They just sit around. No, is that so? Of course it is. They just sit around, except maybe when there's a war, then they go to the war. But other times they just lazy around or go hawking, just hawking and shh, do you hear a noise? We skipped out and looked, but it warn't nothing but the flutter of a steamboat's wheel away down, coming round the point, so we come back. Yeah, says I, and other times when things is dull, they fuss with the Parliament, and if everybody don't go just so, he whacks their heads off. But mostly they hang round the harem. Round the which? Harem. What's the harem? The place where he keeps his wives. Don't you know about the harem? Solomon had one. He had about 1,000,000 wives. Why, yes, that's so. I done forgot it. A harem's a boarding house, I reckon. Most likely they has rackety times in the nursery. And I reckon the wives quarrels considerable, and that crease the racket. Yet they say Solomon the wisest man that ever lived. I don't take no stock in that. Because why? Would a wise man want to live in the midst of such a blim-blamming all the time? No, 'deed he wouldn't. A wise man would take and build a boiler factory, and then he could shut down the boiler factory when he want to rest. Well, but he was the wisest man anyway, because the widow she told me so her own self. I don't care what the widow say, he warn't no wise man nother. He had some of the dad-fetchest ways I ever see. Does you know about that child that he is going to chop in two? Yes, the widow told me all about it. Well, then, want that the beatin'est notion in the world? You just take and look at it a minute. That's the stump, da. That's one of the women. Here's you. That's the other one. I's Solomon. And this here dollar bill's the child. Both on you claims it. What does I do? Does I shin around amongst the neighbors and find out which of you do the bill belong to? And hand it over to the right one, all safe and sound, the way that anybody that had any gumption would? No, I take and whack the bill in two and give half of 'em to you and half of the others to the other woman. That's the way Solomon was going to do with the child. Now I want to ask you, what's the use of that half a bill? Can't buy nothing with it. And what use is half a child? I wouldn't give a darn for 1,000,000 of 'em. But hang it, Jim, you clean missed the point. Blame it, you've missed it 1,000 mile. Oh, me? Go along. Don't talk to me about your pints. I reckon I know sense when I sees it, and they ain't no sense in such doing as that. Dispute warn't about a half a child, dispute was about a whole child, and the man that thinks he can settle a dispute about a whole child with a half a child don't know enough to come out in the rain. Don't talk to me about Solomon, Huck. I knows him by the back. But I tell you, you don't get the point. Blame the point. I reckon I knows what I knows, and mind you, the real point is down further. It's down deeper. It lays in the way Solomon was raised. You take a man that's got only 1 or 2 children, is that man going to be wasteful of children? No, he ain't. He can't afford it. He knows how to value 'em. But you take a man that's got about 5,000,000 children running round the house, and it's different. He as soon chop a child in two as a cat. They's plenty more. A child or two, more or less, want no consequence to Solomon, that'd fetch him. I never see such a nigger. If he got a notion in his head once, there warn't no getting it out again. He was the most down on Solomon of any nigger I ever see. So I went to talking about other kings and let Solomon slide. I told about Louis XVI that got his head cut off in France a long time ago, and about his little boy, the Dolphin, that would have been king, but they took and shut him up in jail, and some say he died there. Poor little chap. But some says he got out and got away and come to America. That's good, but he'd be pretty lonesome. They ain't no kings here, is they, Huck? No, Then he can't get no situation. What he going to do? Well, I don't know. Some of them gets on the police, and some of them learns people how to talk French. Why, Huck, don't the French people talk the same way that we does? No, Jim, you couldn't understand a word they said, not a single word. Well, now, I be dang busted. How did that come? I don't know, but it's so. I got some of their jabber out of a book. Suppose a man was to come to you and say, "Parlez-vous Français?" What would you think? Well, I wouldn't think nothing. I'd take and bust him over the head. That is, if he want white. I don't allow no nigger to call me that. Shucks, it ain't calling you anything. It's only saying, do you know how to talk French? Well, then, why couldn't he say it? Why, he is a-saying it. That's a Frenchman's way of saying it. Well, it's a blame ridiculous way, and I don't want to hear no more about it. There ain't no sense in it. Looky here, Jim. Does a cat talk like we do? No, a cat don't. Well, does a cow? No, a cow don't nuther. Does a cat talk like a cow, or a cow talk like a cat? No, they don't. It's natural and right for 'em to talk different from each other, ain't it? Of course. And ain't it natural and right for a cat and a cow to talk different from us? Why, most surely it is. Well, then, why ain't it natural and right for a Frenchman to talk different from us? You answer me that. Is a cat a man, Huck? No. Well, then, there ain't no sense in a cat talking like a man. Is a cow a man? Or is a cow a cat? Nah, she ain't either of 'em. Well, then, she ain't got no business to talk like either one or the other of 'em. Is a Frenchman a man? Yes. Well, then, dad blame it, why don't he talk like a man? You answer me that. I see it warn't no use wasting words. You can't learn a nigger to argue. So I quit.
File 15.
Chapter 15. We judged that 3 nights more would fetch us to Cairo at the bottom of Illinois, where the Ohio River comes in, and that was what we was after. We would sell the raft and get on a steamboat and go way up the Ohio amongst the free states, and then be out of trouble. Well, the second night a fog begun to come on, and we made for a towhead to tie to, for it wouldn't do to try to run in a fog. But when I paddled ahead in the canoe with a line to make fast, there weren't anything but little saplings to tie to. I passed the line around one of them right on the edge of the cut bank, but there was a stiff current, and the raft come booming down so lively she tore it out by the roots, and away she went. I see the fog closing down, and it made me so sick and scared I couldn't budge for most half a minute, it seemed to me. And then there warn't no raft in sight. You couldn't see 20 yards. I jumped into the canoe and run back to the stern and grabbed the paddle and set her back a stroke, but she didn't come. I was in such a hurry I hadn't untied her. I got up and tried to untie her, but I was so excited my hands shook so I couldn't hardly do anything with them. As soon as I got started, I took out after the raft, hot and heavy, right down the towhead. That was all right as far as it went, but the towhead warn't 60 yards long, and the minute I flew by the foot of it, I shot out into the solid white fog and hadn't no more idea which way I was going than a dead man. Thinks I, it won't do to paddle. First I know I'll run into the bank or a towhead or something. I gotta set still and float. And yet it's mighty fidgety business to have to hold your hands still at such a time. I whooped and listened. Away down there somewheres I hears a small whoop, and up come my spirits. I went tearing after it, listening sharp to hear it again. The next time it come, I see I warn't heading for it, but heading away to the right of it. And the next time I was heading away to the left of it, and not gaining on it much either. For I was flying around, this way and that and t'other, but it was going straight ahead all the time. I did wish the fool would think to beat a tin pan, and beat it all the time, but he never did, and it was the still places between the whoops that was making the trouble for me. Well, I fought along, and directly I hears the whoop behind me. I was tangled good now. That was somebody else's whoop, or else I was turned around. I throwed the paddle down. I heard the whoop again. It was behind me yet, but in a different place. It kept coming and changing its place, and I kept answering, till by and by it was in front of me again, and I knowed the current had swung the canoe's head downstream, and I was all right if that was Jim and not some other rascalman hollering. I couldn't tell nothing about voices in a fog, for nothing don't look natural nor sound natural in a fog. The whooping went on, and in about a minute I come a-booming down on a cut bank with smoky ghosts of big trees on it, and the current throwed me off to the left and shot by amongst a lot of snags that fairly roared. The current was tearing by them so swift. In another second or two it was solid white and still again. I sat perfectly still then, listening to my heart thump, and I reckon I didn't draw a breath while it thumped 100. I just give up then. I knowed what the matter was. That cut bank was an island, and Jim had gone down to other side of it. It warn't no towhead that you could float by in 10 minutes. It had the big timber of a regular island. It might be 5 or 6 miles long and more than half a mile wide. I kept quiet with my ears cocked. About 15 minutes, I reckon. I was floating along, of course, 4 or 5 miles an hour, but you don't ever think of that. No, you feel like you're laying dead still in the water, and if a little glimpse of a snag slips by, you don't think to yourself how fast you're going, but you catch your breath and think, my, how that snag's tearing along. If you think it ain't dismal and lonesome out in the fog that way by yourself in the night, you try it once, you'll see. Next, for about half an hour, I whoops now and then, and at last I hears the answer a long ways off, and tries to follow it. But I couldn't do it, and directly I judged I'd got into a nest of towheads, for I had little dim glimpses of them on both sides of me, sometimes just a narrow channel between, and some that I couldn't see I knowed was there because I'd hear the wash of the current against the old dead brush and trash that hung over the banks. Well, I warn't long loosing the whoops down amongst the towheads, and I only tried to chase them a little while anyway, because it was worse than chasing a jack-o'-lantern. You never knowed a sound dodge around so, and swap places so quick and so much. I had to claw away from the bank pretty lively 4 or 5 times to keep from knocking the islands out of the river, and so I judged the raft must be butting into the bank every now and then, or else it would get farther ahead and clear out of hearing. It was floating a little faster than what I was. Well, I seemed to be in the open river again by and by, but I couldn't hear no sign of a whoop nowheres. I reckon Jim had fetched up on a snag, maybe, and it was all up with him. I was good and tired, so I laid down in the canoe and said I wouldn't bother no more. I didn't want to go to sleep, of course, but I was so sleepy I couldn't help it. So I thought I would just take one little cat nap. But I reckon it was more than a cat nap, for when I waked up the stars was shining bright, the fog was all gone, and I was spinning down a big bend stern first. First I didn't know where I was. I thought I was dreaming. When things began to come back to me, they seemed to come up dim out of last week. It was a monstrous big river here, with the tallest and thickest kind of timber on both banks, just a solid wall as well as I could see by the stars. I looked away downstream and see a black speck on the water. I took after it, but when I got to it, it warn't nothing but a couple of saw logs made fast together. Then I see another speck and chased that. Then another, and this time I was right. It was the raft. When I got to it, Jim was setting there with his head down between his knees asleep, with his right arm hanging over the steering oar. The other oar was smashed off, and the raft was littered up with leaves and branches and dirt. She'd had a rough time. I made fast and laid down under Jim's nose on the raft and began to gap, and stretched my fists out against Jim and says, "Hello, Jim, have I been asleep? Why didn't you stir me up?"
"Goodness gracious, is that you, Huck? And you ain't dead? You ain't drownded? You's back again? It's too good for true, honey, it's too good for true. Lemme look at you, child. Lemme feel of you. No, you ain't dead, you's back again. Live and sound, just the same old Huck, just the same old Huck, thanks to goodness."
"What's the matter with you, Jim? You been a-drinking?"
"Drinking? Has I been a-drinking? Has I had a chance to be a-drinking?"
"Well, then, what makes you talk so wild?"
How does I talk wild?
How? Why, hain't you been talking about my coming back and all that stuff as if I'd been gone away?
Huck Finn, you look me in the eye. Look me in the eye. Hain't you been gone away?
Gone away? Why, what in the nation do you mean? I hain't been gone anywheres. Where would I go to?
Well, looky here, boss. Dey's something wrong, dey is. Is I me, or who is I? Is I here, or where is I? Now that's what I wants to know.
Well, I think you're here plain enough, but I think you're a tangle-headed old fool, Jim.
I is I? Well, you answer me dis. Didn't you tote out the line in the canoe for to make fast to the towhead?
No, I didn't. What towhead? I ain't seen no towhead.
You ain't seen no towhead? Looky here, didn't the line pull loose and the raft go a-hummin' down the river and leave you and the canoe behind in the fog?
What fog?
Why, the fog that's been around all night. And didn't you whoop and didn't I whoop till we got mixed up in the islands and one of us got lost and the other one was just as good as lost 'cause he didn't know what he was? And didn't I bust up again a lot of them islands and have a terrible time and most get drownded? Now ain't that so, boss? Ain't it so? You answer me that.
Well, this is too many for me, Jim. I hain't seen no fog, nor no islands, nor no troubles, nor nothing. I've been sitting here talking with you all night till you went to sleep about 10 minutes ago, and I reckon I done the same. You couldn't have got drunk in that time, so of course you've been dreaming.
Dad, fetch it, how's I going to dream all that in 10 minutes?
Well, hang it all, you did dream it because there didn't any of it happen.
But Huck, it's all just as plain to me as...
It don't make no difference how plain it is. There ain't nothing in it. I know because I've been here all the time. Jim didn't say nothing for about 5 minutes, but sat there studying over it. Then he says,
Well then, I reckon I did dream it, Huck. But dog my cats if it ain't the powerfulest dream I ever see. And I hain't ever had no dream before that's tired me like this one.
Oh, well, that's all right, because a dream does tire a body like everything sometimes. But this one was a staving dream. Tell me about it, Jim. So Jim went to work and told me the whole thing right through, just as it happened, only he painted it up considerable. Then he said he must start in and interpret it, because it was sent for a warning. He said the first towhead stood for a man that would try to do us some good, but the current was another man that would get us away from him. The whoops was warnings that would come to us every now and then, and if we didn't try hard to make out to understand them, they'd just take us into bad luck, stead of keeping us out of it. The lot of towheads was troubles we was going to get into with quarrelsome people and all kinds of mean folks, but if we minded our business and didn't talk back and aggravate them, we would pull through and get out of the fog and into the big clear river, which was the Free States, and wouldn't have no more trouble. It had clouded up pretty dark just after I got onto the raft, but it was clearing up again now. Oh, well, that's all interpreted well enough as far as it goes, Jim, I says. But what does these things stand for? It was the leaves and rubbish on the raft and the smashed oar. You could see them first-rate now. Jim looked at the trash and then looked at me and back at the trash again. He had got the dream fixed so strong in his head that he couldn't seem to shake it loose and get the facts back into its place again right away. But when he did get the thing straightened around, he looked at me steady without ever smiling and says,
What do they stand for? Well, I was going to tell you. When I got all wore out with the work and with the calling for you and went to sleep, my heart was most broke because you was lost, and you didn't care no more what become of me in the raft. And when I wake up and find you back again, all safe and sound, the tears come, and I could have got down on my knees and kissed your foot, I was so thankful. And all you was thinking about was how you could make a fool of old Jim with a lie. That truck there is trash, and trash is what people is that puts dirt on the heads of their friends and makes 'em ashamed.
Then he got up slow and walked to the wigwam and went in there without saying anything but that. But that was enough. It made me feel so mean I could almost kiss his foot to get him to take it back. It was 15 minutes before I could work myself up to go and humble myself to a nigger, but I done it, and I warn't ever sorry for it afterwards, neither. I didn't do him no more mean tricks, and I wouldn't have done that one if I'd have knowed it would make him feel that way.
File 16.
Chapter 16. We slept most all day and started out at night, a little ways behind a monstrous long raft that was as long going by as a procession. She had 4 long sweeps at each end, so we judged she carried as many as 30 men likely. She had 5 big wigwams aboard, wide apart, and an open campfire in the middle, and a tall flagpole at each end. There was a power of style about her. It amounted to something, being a raftsman on such a craft as that. We went drifting down into a big bend, and the night clouded up and got hot. The river was very wide, and was walled with solid timber on both sides. You couldn't see a break in it hardly ever, or a light. We talked about Cairo, and wondered whether we would know it when we got to it. I said likely we wouldn't, because I had heard say there warn't but about a dozen houses there, and if they didn't happen to have them lit up, how was we going to know we was passing a town? Jim said if the 2 big rivers joined together there, that would show. But I said maybe we might think we was passing the foot of an island and coming into the same old river again. That disturbed Jim, and me too. So the question was what to do. I said paddle ashore the first time a light showed, and tell them Pap was behind, come along with a trading scow, and was a green hand at the business and wanted to know how far it was to Cairo. Jim thought it was a good idea, so we took a smoke on it and waited. There warn't nothing to do now but to look out sharp for the town and not pass it without seeing it. He said he'd be mighty sure to see it because he'd be a free man the minute he seen it, but if he missed it he'd be in a slave country again and no more show for freedom. Every little while he jumps up and says, "Dar she is?" But it warn't. It was jack-o'-lanterns and lightning bugs, so he sat down again and went to watching, same as before. Jim said it made him all over trembly and feverish to be so close to freedom. Well, I can tell you it made me all over trembly and feverish too to hear him, because I begun to get it through my head that he was most free, and who was to blame for it? Why, me. I couldn't get that out of my conscience, no how nor no way. It got to troubling me so I couldn't rest. I couldn't stay still in one place. It hadn't ever come home to me before, what this thing was that I was doing, but now it did, and it stayed with me and scorched me more and more. I tried to make out to myself that I warn't to blame, because I didn't run Jim off from his rightful owner, but it warn't no use. Conscience up and says every time, but you knowed he was running for his freedom, and you could have paddled ashore and told somebody. That was so. I couldn't get around that no way. That was where it pinched. Conscience says to me, "What had poor Miss Watson done to you that you could see her nigger go right off under your eyes and never say one single word? What did that poor old woman do to you that you could treat her so mean? Why, she tried to learn you your book. She tried to learn you your manners. She tried to be good to you every way she knowed how. That's what she done." I got to feeling so mean and so miserable I most wished I was dead. I fidgeted up and down the raft, abusing myself to myself, and Jim was fidgeting up and down past me. We neither of us could keep still. Every time he danced around and says, "Dar's Cairo," it went through me like a shot, and I thought if it was Cairo, I'd reckon I'd die of miserableness. Jim talked out loud all the time while I was talking to myself. He was saying how the first thing he would do when he got to a free state, he would go to saving up money and never spend a single cent, and when he got enough, he would buy his wife, which was owned on a farm close to where Miss Watson lived, and then they would both work to buy the 2 children, and if their master wouldn't sell them, then they'd get an abolitionist to go and steal them. It most froze me to hear such talk. He wouldn't ever dared to talk such talk in his life before. Just see what a difference it made in him the minute he judged he was about free. It was according to the old saying, give a nigger an inch and he'll take an ell. Thinks I, this is what comes of my not thinking. Here was this nigger, which I as good as helped to run away, come right out flat-footed and saying he would steal his children. Children that belonged to a man I didn't even know, a man that hadn't ever done me no harm. I was sorry to hear Jim say that. It was such a lowering of him. My conscience got to stirring me up hotter than ever, until at last I says to it, let up on me, it ain't too late yet. I'll paddle ashore at the first light and tell. I felt easy and happy and light as a feather right off. All my troubles was gone. I went to looking out sharp for a light and sort of singing to myself. By and by one showed. Jim sings out,
We safe, Huck, we safe. Jump up and crack your heels. That's the good old Cairo at last, I just knows it.
I says, I'll take the canoe and go see, Jim. It mightn't be, you know. He jumped and got the canoe ready and put his old coat in the bottom for me to set on and give me the paddle, and as I shoved off he says,
Pretty soon I'll be a-shouting for joy, and I'll say, it's all on accounts of Huck. I's a free man, and I couldn't have been free if it hadn't been for Huck. Huck done it. Jim won't ever forget you, Huck. You's the best friend Jim's ever had, and you's the only friend old Jim's got now.
I was paddling off all in a sweat to tell on him, but when he says this, it seemed to kind of take the tuck all out of me. I went along slow then, and I warn't right down certain whether I was glad I started or whether I warn't. When I was 50 yards off, Jim says,
There you goes, the old true Huck, the only white gentleman that ever kept his promise to old Jim.
Well, I just felt sick, but I says, I got to do it. I can't get out of it. Right then along comes a skiff with 2 white men in it with guns, and they stopped, and I stopped. One of them says, What's that yonder? A piece of raft, I says. You belong on it? Yes, sir. Any men on it? Only one, sir. Well, there's 5 niggers run off tonight up yonder above the head of the bend. Is your man white or black? I didn't answer up prompt. I tried to, but the words wouldn't come. I tried for a second or two to brace up and out with it, but I warn't man enough. Hadn't the spunk of a rabbit. I see I was weakening, so I just give up trying and up and says, He's white. I reckon we'll go and see for ourselves. I wish you would, says I, because it's Pap that's there, and maybe you'd help me tow the raft ashore where the light is. He's sick, and so is Ma'am and Mary Ann. Oh, the devil, we're in a hurry, boy, but I suppose we've got to. Come, buckle to your paddle, and let's get along. I buckled to my paddle, and they laid to their oars. When we had made a stroke or two, I says, Pap'll be mighty much obliged to see you, I can tell you. Everybody goes away when I want them to help me tow the raft ashore, and I can't do it by myself. Well, that's infernal mean, odd, too. Say, boy, what's the matter with your father? It's well, it ain't much. They stopped pulling. It warn't but a mighty little ways to the raft now. One says, Boy, that's a lie. What is the matter with your pap? Answer up square now, and it'll be better for you. I will, sir, I will, honest, but don't leave us, please. It's oh, gentlemen, if you'll only pull ahead and let me heave you to headline, you won't have to come near the raft, please do. Set it back, John, set it back, says one. They backed water. Keep away, boy, keep to Lord. Confound it, I just expect the wind has blowed it to us. Your pap's got the smallpox, and you know it precious well. Why didn't you come out and say so? You want to spread it all over? Well, I says a blubbering, I've told everybody before, and they just went away and left us. Poor devil, there's something in that. We're right down sorry for you, but well, hang it, we don't want the smallpox, you see. Looky here, I tell you what you do. Don't you try to land by yourself, or you'll smash everything to pieces. You float along down about 20 miles, and you'll come to a town on the left side of the river. It will be along after sunup then, and when you ask for help, you tell 'em your folks are all down with chills and fever. Don't be a fool again, let people guess what's the matter. Now we're trying to do you a kindness, so you just put 20 miles between us. That's a good boy. It wouldn't do any good to land yonder where the light is. It's only a wood yard. Say, I reckon your father's poor, and I'm bound to say he's in pretty hard luck. Here, I put a $20 gold piece on this board. Now you get it when it floats by. I feel mighty mean to leave you, but my kingdom, it won't do to fool with smallpox, don't you see? Hold on, Parker, says the other man. Here's a 20 to put on the board for me. Goodbye, boy. Do as your Mr. Parker told you, and you be all right. That's so, my boy. Goodbye, goodbye. If you see any runaway niggers, you get help and nab 'em, and you can make some money by it. Goodbye, sir, says I. I won't let no runaway niggers get by me if I can help it. They went off, and I got aboard the raft, feeling bad and low, because I knowed very well I had done wrong. And I see it warn't no use for me to try to learn to do right. A body that don't get started right when he's little ain't got no show. When the pinch comes, there ain't nothing to back him up and keep him to his work, and so he gets beat. Then I thought for a minute, and says to myself, hold on, suppose you'd have done right and give Jim up. Would you felt better than what you do now? No, says I, I'd feel bad. I'd feel just the same way I do now. Well, then, says I, what's the use of you learning to do right when it's troublesome to do right and ain't no trouble to do wrong, and the wages is just the same? I was stuck and couldn't answer that, so I reckoned I wouldn't bother no more about it, but after this always do whichever come handiest at the time. I went into the wigwam. Jim warn't there. I looked all around. He warn't anywhere. I says, Jim.
Here I is, Huck. Is they out of sight yet? Don't talk loud.
He was in the river under the stern oar, with just his nose out. I told him they were out of sight so he could come aboard. He says, I was a-listen to all the talk, and I slips into the river and was going to shove for shore if they come aboard. Then I was going to swim to the raft again when they was gone. But lawsy, how you did fool 'em, Huck. That was the smartest dodge. I tell you, child, I expect you save old Jim. Old Jim ain't going to forget you for that, honey. Then we talked about the money. It was a pretty good raise, $20 apiece. Jim said we could take deck passage on a steamboat now, and the money would last us as far as we wanted to go in the Free States. He said 20 mile more warn't far for the raft to go, but he wished we was already there. Towards daybreak we tied up, and Jim was mighty particular about hiding the raft good. Then he worked all day fixing things in bundles and getting all ready to quit rafting. That night about 10 we hove in sight of the lights of a town away down in a left-hand bend. I went off in the canoe to ask about it. Pretty soon I found a man out in the river with a skiff, setting a trot line. I ranged up and says, Mister, is that town Cairo? Cairo? No, you must be a blame fool. What town is it, mister? If you want to know, go and find out. If you stay here bothering around me for about half a minute longer, you'll get something you won't want. I paddled to the raft. Jim was awful disappointed, but I said never mind. Cairo would be the next place, I reckoned. We passed another town before daylight, and I was going out again, but it was high ground, so I didn't go. No high ground about Cairo, Jim said. I'd forgot it. We laid up for the day on a towhead tolerable close to the left-hand bank. I'd begun to suspicion something. So did Jim. I says, maybe we went by Cairo in the fog that night. He says,
Don't let's talk about it, Huck. Poor niggers can't have no luck. I always expected that rattlesnake skin one done with its work.
I wish I'd never seen that snake skin, Jim. I do wish I'd never laid eyes on it.
It ain't your fault, Huck. You didn't know. Don't you blame yourself about it.
When it was daylight, here was the clear Ohio water inshore, sure enough, and outside was the old regular muddy. So it was all up with Cairo. We talked it all over. It wouldn't do to take to the shore. We couldn't take the raft up the stream, of course. There warn't no way but to wait for dark and start back in the canoe and take the chances. So we slept all day amongst the cottonwood thickets so to be fresh for the work, and when we went back to the raft about dark, the canoe was gone. We didn't say a word for a good while. There warn't anything to say. We both knowed well enough it was some more work of the rattlesnake skin, so what was the use to talk about it? It would only look like we was finding fault, and that would be bound to fetch more bad luck, and keep on fetching it too, till we knowed enough to keep still. By and by we talked about what we better do, and found there warn't no way but just to go along down with the raft till we got a chance to buy a canoe to go back in. We warn't going to borrow it when there warn't anybody around, the way Pap would do, for that might set people after us. So we shoved out after dark on the raft. Anybody that don't believe yet that it's foolishness to handle a snakeskin after all that snakeskin done for us will believe it now if they read on and see what more it done for us. The place to buy canoes is off of rafts laying up at shore, but we didn't see no rafts laying up, so we went along during 3 hours and more. Well, the night got gray and rather thick, which is the next meanest thing to fog. You can't tell the shape of the river, and you can't see no distances. It got to be very late and still, and then along comes a steamboat up the river. We lit the lantern and judged she would see it. Upstream boats didn't generally come close to us. They go out and follow the bars and hunt for easy water under the reefs. But nights like this they bull right up the channel against the whole river. We could hear her pounding along, but we didn't see her good till she was close. She aimed right for us. Often they do that and try to see how close they can come without touching. Sometimes the wheel bites off a sweep, and then the pilot sticks his head out and laughs, and thinks he's mighty smart. Well, here she comes, and we said she was going to try and shave us, but she didn't seem to be shearing off a bit. She was a big one, and she was coming in a hurry, too, looking like a black cloud with rows of glowworms around it. But all of a sudden she bulged out, big and scary, with a long row of wide-open furnace doors shining like red-hot teeth, and her monstrous bows and guards hanging right over us. There was a yell at us and a jingling of bells to stop the engines, a powwow of cussing and a whistling of steam, and as Jim went overboard on one side and I on the other, she come smashing straight through the raft. I dived, and I aimed to find the bottom, too, for a 30-foot wheel had got to go over me, and I wanted it to have plenty of room. I could always stay under water a minute. This time I reckoned I had stayed under a minute and a half. Then I bounced up for the top in a hurry, for I was nearly busting. I popped out to my armpits and blowed the water out of my nose and puffed a bit. Of course there was a booming current, and of course that boat started her engines again 10 seconds after she stopped them, for they never cared much for raftsmen. So now she was churning along up the river out of sight in the thick weather, though I could hear her. I sung out for Jim about a dozen times, but I didn't get an answer, so I grabbed a plank that touched me while I was treading water and struck out for shore, shoving it ahead of me. But I made out to see that the drift of the current was towards the left-hand shore, which meant that I was in a crossing, so I changed off and went that way. It was one of these long, slanting 2-mile crossings, so I was a good long time in getting over. I made a safe landing and clumb up on the bank. I couldn't see but a little ways, but I went poking along over rough ground for a quarter of a mile or more, and then I run across a big old-fashioned double log house before I noticed it. I was going to rush by and get away, but a lot of dogs jumped out and went to howling and barking at me, and I knowed better than to move another peg.
File 17.
Chapter 17. In about a minute, somebody spoke out of a window without putting his head out and says, "Be done, boys. Who's there?" I says, "It's me." "Who's me?" "George Jackson, sir." "What do you want?" "I don't want nothing, sir. I only want to get along by, but the dogs won't let me." "What are you prowling around here this time of night for, eh?" "I warn't prowling around, sir. I fell overboard off of the steamboat." "Oh, you did you? Strike a light there, somebody. What did you say your name was?" "George Jackson, sir. I'm only a boy." "Now look here, if you're telling the truth, you needn't be afraid. Nobody'll hurt you. But don't try to budge. Stand right where you are. Rouse out Bob and Tom, some of you, and fetch the guns. George Jackson, is there anybody with you?" "No, sir, nobody." I heard the people stirring around in the house now and see a light. The man sung out, Snatch that light away, Betsy, you old fool. Ain't you got any sense? Put it on the floor behind the front door. Bob, if you and Tom are ready, take your places. All ready. Now, George Jackson, do you know the Shepherdsons? No, sir, I never heard of them. Well, that may be so, and it mayn't. Now, all ready. Step forward, George Jackson, and mind, don't you hurry. Come mighty slow. If there's anybody with you, let him keep back. If he shows himself, he'll be shot. Come along now, come slow. Push the door open yourself. Just enough to squeeze in, do you hear? I didn't hurry. I couldn't if I'd have wanted to. I took one slow step at a time, and there warn't a sound, only I thought I could hear my heart. The dogs were as still as the humans, but they followed a little behind me. When I got to the 3 log doorsteps, I heard them unlocking and unbarring and unbolting. I put my hand on the door and pushed it a little and a little more till somebody said, "There, that's enough. Put your head in." I done it, but I judged they would take it off. The candle was on the floor, and there they all was, looking at me, and me at them, for about a quarter of a minute. 3 big men with guns pointed at me, which made me wince, I tell you. The oldest, gray and about 60, the other 2 30 or more, all of them fine and handsome, and the sweetest old gray-headed lady, and back of her 2 young women, which I couldn't see right well. The old gentleman says, "There, I reckon it's all right. Come in." As soon as I was in, the old gentleman, he locked the door and barred it and bolted it, and told the young men to come in with their guns, and they all went in a big parlor that had a new rag carpet on the floor, and got together in a corner that was out of the range of the front windows. There warn't none on the side. They held the candle and took a good look at me and said, "Why, he ain't a Shepherdson. No, there ain't any Shepherdson about him." Then the old man said he hoped I wouldn't mind being searched for arms, because he didn't mean no harm by it. It was only to make sure. So he didn't pry into my pockets, but only felt outside with his hands and said it was all right. He told me to make myself easy and at home, and to tell all about myself, but the old lady says, "Why, bless you, Saul, the poor thing's as wet as he can be, and don't you reckon it may be he's hungry?" "True for you, Rachel, I forgot." So the old lady says, "Betsy," this was a nigger woman, "you fly around and get him something to eat as quick as you can, poor thing, and one of you girls go up and wake Buck and tell him. Oh, here he is himself. Buck, take this little stranger and get the wet clothes off of him, and dress him up in some of yours that's dry." Buck looked about as old as me, 13 or 14 or along there, though he was a little bigger than me. He hadn't on anything but a shirt, and he was very frowsy-headed. He came in gaping and digging one fist into his eyes, and he was dragging a gun along with the other one. He says, "Ain't they no Shepherdsons around?" They said no, 'twas a false alarm. "Well," he says, "if they'd have been some, I'd reckon I'd have got one." They all laughed, and Bob says, "Why, Buck, they might have scalped us all, you've been so slow in coming." "Well, nobody come after me, and it ain't right I'm always kept down. I don't get no show." "Never mind, Buck, my boy," says the old man. "You'll have show enough, all in good time. Don't you fret about that. Go along with you now and do as your mother told you." When we got upstairs to his room, he got me a coarse shirt and a roundabout and pants of his, and I put them on. While I was at it, he asked me what my name was, but before I could tell him, he started to tell me about a blue jay and a young rabbit he had catched in the woods day before yesterday, and he asked me where Moses was when the candle went out. I said I didn't know. I hadn't heard about it before, no way. "Well, guess," he says. "How am I going to guess," says I, "when I never heard tell of it before?" "But you can guess, can't you? It's just as easy." "Which candle?" I says. "Why, any candle," he says. "I don't know where he was," says I. "Where was he?" "Why, he was in the dark. That's where he was." "Well, if you knowed where he was, what did you ask me for?" "Why, blame it, it's a riddle, don't you see? Say, how long are you going to stay here? You got to stay always. We can just have booming times. They don't have no school now. Do you own a dog?" I've got a dog, and he'll go in the river and bring out chips that you throw in. Do you like to comb up Sundays and all that kind of foolishness? You bet I don't, but Ma, she makes me. Confound these old britches. I reckon I better put 'em on, but I'd rather not. It's so warm. Are you all ready? All right, come along, old hoss. Cold corn pone, cold corned beef, butter, and buttermilk. That is what they had for me down there, and there ain't nothing better that I've ever come across yet. Buck and his ma and all of them smoked cob pipes, except the nigger woman, which was gone, and the two young women. They all smoked and talked, and I eat and talked. The young women had quilts around them and their hair down their backs. They all asked me questions, and I told them how Pap and me and all the family was living on a little farm down at the bottom of Arkansas, and my sister Mary Ann run off and got married and never was heard of no more. And Bill went to hunt them, and he warn't heard of no more. And Tom and Mort died, and then there warn't nobody but just me and Pap left, and he was just trimmed down to nothing on account of his troubles. So when he died, I took what there was left, because the farm didn't belong to us, and started up the river deck passage and fell overboard, and that was how I come to be here. So they said I could have a home there as long as I wanted it. Then it was most daylight, and everybody went to bed, and I went to bed with Buck. And when I waked up in the morning, drat it all, I had forgot what my name was. So I laid there about an hour trying to think, and when Buck waked up, I says, "Can you spell, Buck?" "Yes," he says. "I bet you can't spell my name," says I. "I bet you what you dare I can," says he. "Well, all right," says I, "go ahead." Georgaxon. There now, he says. "Well," says I, "you done it, but I didn't think you could. It ain't no slouch of a name to spell right off without studying." I set it down private because somebody might want me to spell it next, and so I wanted to be handy with it and rattle it off like I was used to it. It was a mighty nice family, and a mighty nice house, too. I hadn't seen no house out in the country before that was so nice and had so much style. It didn't have an iron latch on the front door, nor a wooden one with a buckskin string, but a brass knob to turn, the same as houses in town. There warn't no bed in the parlor, nor a sign of a bed, but heaps of parlors in towns had beds in them. There was a big fireplace that was bricked on the bottom, and the bricks was kept clean and red by pouring water on them and scrubbing them with another brick. Sometimes they wash them over with red water paint that they call Spanish brown, same as they do in town. They had big brass dog irons that could hold up a saw log. There was a clock on the middle of the mantelpiece with a picture of a town painted on the bottom half of the glass front, and a round place in the middle of it for the sun, and you could see the pendulum swinging behind it. It was beautiful to hear that clock tick, and sometimes when one of these peddlers had been along and scoured her up and got her in good shape, she would start in and strike 150 before she got tuckered out. They wouldn't have took any money for her. Well, there was a big outlandish parrot on each side of the clock, made out of something like chalk, and painted up gaudy. By one of the parrots was a cat made of crockery, and a crockery dog by the other, and when you pressed down on them they squeaked, but didn't open their mouths, nor look different nor interested. They squeaked through underneath. There was a couple of big wild turkey wing fans spread out behind these things. On the table in the middle of the room was a kind of a lovely crockery basket that had apples and oranges and peaches and grapes piled up in it, which was much redder and yellower and purtier than the real ones is, but they warn't real because you could see where pieces had got chipped off and showed the white chalk or whatever it was underneath. This table had a cover made out of beautiful oilcloth, with a red and blue spread eagle painted on it, and a painted border all around. It come all the way from Philadelphia, they said. There was some books, too, piled up perfectly exact on each corner of the table. One was a big family Bible full of pictures. One was Pilgrim's Progress, about a man that left his family. It didn't say why. I read considerable in it now and then. The statements was interesting, but tough. Another one was Friendship's Offering, full of beautiful stuff and poetry, but I didn't read the poetry. Another was Henry Clay's Speeches, and another was Dr. Gunn's Family Medicine, which told you all about what to do if a body was sick or dead. There was a hymn book and a lot of other books, and there was nice split-bottom chairs, and perfectly sound too, not bagged down in the middle and busted like an old basket. They had pictures hung on the walls, mainly Washingtons and Lafayette's and battles, and Highland Marys, and one called Signing the Declaration. There was some that they called crayons, which one of the daughters which was dead made her own self when she was only 15 years old. They was different from any pictures I ever see before, blacker mostly than is common. One was a woman in a slim black dress belted small under the armpits, with bulges like a cabbage in the middle of the sleeves, and a large black scoop-shoveled bonnet with a black veil, and white slim ankles crossed about with black tape, and very wee black slippers, like a chisel, and she was leaning pensive on a tombstone on her right elbow, under a weeping willow, and her other hand hanging down her side, holding a white handkerchief and a reticule, and underneath the picture it said, "Shall I never see thee more, alas." Another one was a young lady with her hair all combed up straight to the top of her head, and knotted there in front of a comb like a chair back, and she was crying into a handkerchief and had a dead bird laying on its back in her other hand with its heels up, and underneath the picture it said, "I shall never hear thy sweet chirrup more, alas." There was one where a lady was at a window looking up at the moon, and tears running down her cheeks, and she had an open letter in one hand with black sealing wax showing off one edge of it, and she was mashing a locket with a chain to it against her mouth, and underneath the picture it said, "And art thou gone, yes, thou art gone, alas." These was all nice pictures, I reckon, but I didn't somehow take to them, because if ever I was down a little, they always gave me the fantods. Everybody was sorry she died because she had laid out a lot more of these pictures to do, and a body could see by what she had done what they had lost. But I reckon that with her disposition she was having a better time in the graveyard. She was at work on what they said was her greatest picture when she took sick, and every day and every night it was her prayer to be allowed to live till she got it done, but she never got the chance. It was a picture of a young woman in a long white gown standing on the rail of a bridge all ready to jump off, with her hair all down her back, and looking up to the moon with tears running down her face, and she had 2 arms folded across her breast, and 2 arms stretched out in front, and 2 more reaching up towards the moon, and the idea was to see which pair would look best, and then scratch out all the other arms, but as I was saying, she died before she got her mind made up. And now they kept this picture over the head of the bed in her room, and every time her birthday come they hung flowers on it. Other times it was hid with a little curtain. The young woman in the picture had a kind of a nice sweet face, but there were so many arms it made her look too spidery, seemed to me. This young girl kept a scrapbook when she was alive, and used to paste obituaries and accidents and cases of patient suffering in it out of the Presbyterian Observer, and write poetry after them out of her own head. It was very good poetry. This is what she wrote about a boy by the name of Stephen Dowling Botts that fell down a well and was drowned. Ode to Stephen Dowling Botts, deceased. And did young Stephen sicken, and did young Stephen die, and did the sad hearts thicken, and did the mourners cry? No, such was not the fate of young Stephen Dowling Botts. Though sad hearts round him thickened, 'twas not from sickness shots. No whooping cough did rack his frame, nor measles drear with spots. Not these impaired the sacred name of Stephen Dowling Botts. Despised love struck not with woe that head of curly knots, nor stomach troubles laid him low, young Stephen Dowling Botts. Oh no, then list with tearful eye, whilst I his fate do tell, his soul did from this cold world fly by falling down a well. They got him out and emptied him, alas, it was too late. His spirit was gone for to sport aloft in the realms of the good and great. If Emmeline Grangerford could make poetry like that before she was 14, There ain't no telling what she could have done by and by. Buck said she could rattle off poetry like nothing. She didn't ever have to stop to think. He said she would slap down a line, and if she couldn't find anything to rhyme with it, would just scratch it out and slap down another one and go ahead. She warn't particular. She could write about anything you choose to give her to write about, just so it was sadful. Every time a man died, or a woman died, or a child died, she would be on hand with her tribute before he was cold. She called them tributes. The neighbors said it was the doctor first, then Emmeline, then the undertaker. The undertaker never got in ahead of Emmeline but once, and then she hung fire on a rhyme for the dead person's name, which was Whistler. She warn't ever the same after that. She never complained, but she kind of pined away and did not live long. Poor thing, many's the time I've made myself go up to the little room that used to be hers, and get out her poor old scrapbook and read it when her pictures had been aggravating me and I had soured on her a little. I liked all that family, dead ones and all, and warn't going to let anything come between us. Poor Emmeline made poetry about all the dead people when she was alive, and it didn't seem right that there warn't nobody to make some about her now she was gone. So I tried to sweat out a verse or two myself, but I couldn't seem to make it go somehow. They kept Emmeline's room trim and nice, and all the things fixed in it just the way she liked to have them when she was alive, and nobody ever slept there. The old lady took care of the room herself, though there was plenty of niggers, and she sewed there a good deal and read her Bible there mostly. Well, as I was saying about the parlor, there was beautiful curtains on the windows, white with pictures painted on them of castles with vines all down the walls, and cattle coming down to drink. There was a little old piano, too, that had tin pans in it, I reckon, and nothing was ever so lovely as to hear the young ladies sing "The Last Link is Broken" and play "The Battle of Prague" on it. The walls of all the rooms was plastered, and most had carpets on the floors, and the whole house was whitewashed on the outside. It was a double house, and the big open place betwixt them was roofed and floored, and sometimes the table was set there in the middle of the day, and it was a cool, comfortable place. Nothing could be better. And warn't the cooking good, and just bushels of it, too.
File 18.
Chapter 18. Colonel Grangerford was a gentleman, you see. He was a gentleman all over, and so was his family. He was well born, as the saying is, and that's worth as much in a man as it is in a horse, so the widow Douglas said, and nobody ever denied that she was of the first aristocracy in our town, and Pap he always said it too, though he warn't no more quality than a mudcat himself. Colonel Grangerford was very tall and very slim, and had a darkish, paley complexion, not a sign of red in it anywheres, and he was clean-shaved every morning all over his thin face, and he had the thinnest kind of lips, and the thinnest kind of nostrils, and a high nose, and heavy eyebrows, and the blackest kind of eyes, sunk so deep back that they seemed like they was looking out of caverns at you, as you may say. His forehead was high, and his hair was black and straight and hung to his shoulders. His hands was long and thin, and every day of his life he put on a clean shirt and a full suit from head to foot made out of linen, so white it hurt your eyes to look at it. And on Sundays he wore a blue tailcoat with brass buttons on it. He carried a mahogany cane with a silver head to it. There warn't no frivolousness about him, not a bit, and he warn't ever loud. He was as kind as he could be. You could feel that, you know, and so you had confidence. Sometimes he smiled, and it was good to see, but when he straightened himself up like a liberty pole, and the lightning began to flicker out from under his eyebrows, you wanted to climb a tree first and find out what the matter was afterwards. He didn't ever have to tell anybody to mind their manners. Everybody was always good-mannered where he was. Everybody loved to have him around, too. He was sunshine most always. I mean, he made it seem like good weather. When he turned into a cloud bank, it was awful dark for half a minute, and that was enough. There wouldn't nothing go wrong again for a week. When him and the old lady come down in the morning, all the family got up out of their chairs and give them good day, and didn't set down again till they had set down. Then Tom and Bob went to the sideboard where the decanter was, and mixed a glass of bitters and handed it to him, and he held it in his hand and waited till Tom's and Bob's was mixed, and then they bowed and said, "Our duty to you, sir and madam," and they bowed the least bit in the world and said thank you, and so they drank all three, and Bob and Tom poured a spoonful of water on the sugar and a mite of whiskey or apple brandy in the bottom of their tumblers and give it to me and Buck, and we drank to the old people too. Bob was the oldest and Tom next, tall, beautiful men with very broad shoulders and brown faces, and long black hair and black eyes. They dressed in white linen from head to foot like the old gentleman, and wore broad Panama hats. Then there was Miss Charlotte. She was 25, and tall and proud and grand, but as good as she could be when she warn't stirred up. But when she was, she had a look that would make you wilt in your tracks like her father. She was beautiful. So was her sister, Miss Sophia, but it was a different kind. She was gentle and sweet like a dove, and she was only 20. Each person had their own nigger to wait on them, Buck too. My nigger had a monstrous easy time because I warn't used to having anybody do anything for me, but Buck's was on the jump most of the time. This was all there was of the family now, but there used to be more. 3 sons, they got killed, and Emmeline that died. The old gentleman owned a lot of farms and over 100 niggers. Sometimes a stack of people would come there horseback from 10 or 15 mile around and stay 5 or 6 days and have such junketings round about on the river and dances and picnics in the woods daytimes and balls at the house nights. These people was mostly kinfolks of the family. The men brought their guns with them. It was a handsome lot of quality, I tell you. There was another clan of aristocracy around there, 5 or 6 families, mostly of the name Shepherdson. They was as high-toned and well-born and rich and grand as the tribe of Grangerfords. The Shepherdsons and Grangerfords used the same steamboat landing, which was about 2 miles above our house. So sometimes when I went up there with a lot of our folks, I used to see a lot of the Shepherdsons there on their fine horses. One day Buck and me was away out in the woods hunting and heard a horse comin'. We was crossin' the road. Buck says, "Quick, jump for the woods." We done it, and then peeped down the woods through the leaves. Pretty soon a splendid young man come gallopin' down the road, settin' his horse easy and lookin' like a soldier. He had his gun across his pommel. I had seen him before. It was young Harney Shepherdson. I heard Buck's gun go off at my ear, and Harney's hat tumbled off from his head. He grabbed his gun and rode straight to the place where we was hid, but we didn't wait. We started through the woods on a run. The woods warn't thick, so I looked over my shoulder to dodge the bullet, and twice I seen Harney cover Buck with his gun, and then he rode away the way he come. To get his hat, I reckon, but I couldn't see. We never stopped running till we got home. The old gentleman's eyes blazed a minute. 'Twas pleasure mainly, I judged. Then his face sort of smoothed down, and he says kind of gentle, "I don't like that shooting from behind a bush. Why didn't you step into the road, my boy?" "The Shepherdsons don't bother. They always take advantage." Miss Charlotte, she held her head up like a queen while Buck was telling his tale, and her nostrils spread and her eyes snapped. The 2 young men looked dark, but never said nothing. Miss Sophia, she turned pale, but the color come back when she found a man warn't hurt. Soon as I could get Buck down by the corn cribs under the trees by ourselves, I says, "Did you want to kill him, Buck?" "Well, I bet I did." "What did he do to you?" "Him? He never done nothing to me." "Well, then, what did you want to kill him for?" "Why, nothing, only it's on account of the feud." "What's a feud?" "Why, where was you raised? Don't you know what a feud is?" "Never heard of it before. Tell me about it." "Well," says Buck, "a feud is this way. A man has a quarrel with another man and kills him, and then the other man's brother kills him. Then the other brothers on both sides goes for one another, and then the cousins chip in, and by and by everybody's killed off, and there ain't no more feud. But it's kind of slow and takes a long time." "Has this one been going on long, Buck?" Well, I should reckon. It started 30 year ago or summers along there. There was trouble about something, and then a lawsuit to settle it, and the suit went agin one of the men, and so he up and shot the man that won the suit, which he would naturally do, of course. Anybody would. What was the trouble about, Buck? Land? Well, I reckon maybe. I don't know. Well, who done the shooting? Was it a Grangerford or a Shepherdson? Laws, how do I know? It was so long ago. Don't anybody know? Oh, yes, Pa knows, I reckon, and some of the other old people, but they don't know now what the row was about in the first place. Has there been many killed, Buck? Yes, right smart chance of funerals, but they don't always kill. Pa's got a few buckshot in him, but he don't mind it 'cause he don't weigh much anyway. Bob's been carved up some with a bowie, and Tom's been hurt once or twice. Has anybody been killed this year, Buck? Yes, we got one, and they got one. About 3 months ago, my cousin Bud, 14-year-old, was riding through the woods on t'other side of the river, and didn't have no weapon with him, which was blame foolishness, and in a lonesome place he hears a horse a-comin' behind him, and sees old Baldy Shepherdson a-linkin' after him with his gun in his hand, and his white hair a-flyin' in the wind. Instead of jumpin' off and takin' to the brush, Bud allowed he could outrun him, so they had it nip and tuck for 5 mile or more, the old man a-gainin' all the time, so at last Bud seen it warn't any use, so he stopped and faced around so's to have the bullet holes in front, you know, and the old man he rode up and shot him down. But he didn't get much chance to enjoy his luck, for inside of a year our folks laid him out. I reckon that old man was a coward, Buck. I reckon he warn't a coward, not by a blame sight. There ain't a coward amongst them Shepherdsons, not a one, and there ain't no cowards amongst the Grangerfords neither. Why, that old man kept up his end in a fight one day for half an hour against 3 Grangerfords and come out winner. They was all a horseback. He lit off his horse and got behind a little woodpile and kept his horse before him to stop the bullets. But the Grangerfords stayed on their horses and capered around the old man and peppered away at him, and he peppered away at them. Him and his horse both went home pretty leaky crippled, but the Grangerfords had to be fetched home, and one of 'em was dead and another died the next day. No, sir, if a body's out hunting for cowards, he don't want to fool away any time amongst them Shepherdsons, because they don't breed any of that kind. Next Sunday we all went to church, about 3 mile, everybody a horseback. The men took their guns along, so did Buck, and kept them betwixt their knees or stood them handy against the wall. The Shepherdsons done the same. It was pretty ornery preaching, all about brotherly love and such like tiresomeness, but everybody said it was a good sermon, and they all talked it over going home, and had such a powerful lot to say about faith and good works and free grace and preforedestination, I don't know what all, that it did seem to me to be one of the roughest Sundays I had run across yet. About an hour after dinner, everybody was dozing around, some in their chairs and some in their rooms, and it got to be pretty dull. Buck and a dog was stretched out on the grass in the sun, sound asleep. I went up to our room and judged I would take a nap myself. I found that sweet Miss Sophia standing in her door, which was next to ours, and she took me in her room and shut the door very softly, and asked me if I liked her, and I said I did, and she asked me if I would do something for her and not tell anybody, and I said I would. Then she said she forgot her Testament and left it in the seat at the church between 2 other books, and would I slip out quiet and go there and fetch it to her, and not say nothing to nobody. I said I would. So I slid out and slipped off up the road, and there warn't anybody at the church except maybe a hog or 2, for there warn't any lock on the door, and hogs likes a punchin' floor in summertime because it's cool. If you notice, most folks don't go to church only when they've got to, but a hog is different. Says I to myself, something's up. It ain't natural for a girl to be in such a sweat about a testament. So I give it a shake, and out drops a little piece of paper with 2:30 written on it with a pencil. I ransacked it, but couldn't find anything else. I couldn't make anything out of that, so I put the paper in the book again, and when I got home and upstairs, there was Miss Sophia in her door waiting for me. She pulled me in and shut the door, and then she looked in the Testament till she found the paper, and as soon as she read it, she looked glad, and before a body could think, she grabbed me and give me a squeeze, and said I was the best boy in the world and not to tell anybody. She was mighty red in the face for a minute, and her eyes lighted up, and it made her powerful pretty. I was a good deal astonished, but when I got my breath, I asked her what the paper was about, and she asked me if I had read it, and I said no, and she asked me if I could read writing, and I told her, no, only coarse hand, and then she said the paper warn't anything but a bookmark to keep her place, and I might go and play now. I went off down to the river studying over this thing, and pretty soon I noticed that my nigger was following along behind. When we was out of sight of the house, he looked back and around a second, then comes a-running and says, "Mars George, if you come down into this swamp, I'll show you a whole stack of water moccasins." Thinks I, that's mighty curious. He said that yesterday. He oughter know a body don't love water moccasins enough to go around hunting for 'em. What is he up to anyway? So I says, "All right, trot ahead." I followed half a mile, then he struck out over the swamp and waded ankle deep as much as another half-mile. We come to a little flat piece of land which was dry and very thick with trees and bushes and vines, and he says, "You shove right in dar just a few steps, Mars George. Dar's whar dey is. I seen 'em before. I don't care to see 'em no more." Then he slopped right along and went away, and pretty soon the trees hid him. I poked into the place a ways and come to a little open patch as big as a bedroom, all hung round with vines, and found a man laying there asleep, and by jings, it was my old Jim. I waked him up, and I reckoned it was going to be a grand surprise to him to see me again, but it warn't. He nearly cried, he was so glad, but he warn't surprised. Said he swum along behind me that night and heard me yell every time, but dasn't answer, because he didn't want nobody to pick him up and take him into slavery again. Says he,
"I got hurt a little and couldn't swim fast, so I was a considerable ways behind you towards the last. When you landed, I reckoned I could catch up with you on the land out, having to shout at you. But when I see that house, I began to go slow. I is off too fur to hear what they say to you. I was afraid of the dogs. But when it is all quiet again, I knowed you's in the house. So I struck out for the woods to wait for day. And in the morning, some of the niggers come along, went to the fields, and they tuck me and showed me this place, where the dog can't track me on account of the water. And they brings me truck to eat every night and tells me how you's a-getting along."
"Why didn't you tell my Jack to fetch me here sooner, Jim?"
"Well, 'twa'n't no use to disturb you, Huck, till we could do something. But we's all right now. I been a-buying pots and pans and vittles, as I got a chance, and a-patching up the raft nights when—"
"What raft, Jim?"
"Our old raft."
"You mean to say our old raft warn't smashed all to flinders?"
"No, she warn't. She was tore up a good deal. One end of her was. But they warn't no great harm done, only our traps was most all lost. If we hadn't dived so deep and swum so far under the water, and the night hadn't been so dark, and we warn't so scared, and been such pumpkin heads, as the saying is, we'd a seed the raft. But it's just as well we didn't, 'cause now she's all fixed up again most as good as new, and we's got a new lot of stuff in the place of what is lost."
"Why, how did you get a hold of the raft again, Jim? Did you catch her?"
"How I went to catch her and I out in the woods? No, some of the niggers found her ketched up on a snag along here in the bend, and they hid her in the creek mongst the willows, and they was so much jawing about which of 'em she belonged to, the most that I come to hear about it pretty soon. So I ups and settles the trouble by telling 'em she don't belong to none of 'em but to you and me, and I asked 'em if they gwine to grab a young white gentleman's property and get a hiding for it. Then I give 'em 10 cents apiece, and they is mighty well satisfied and wished some more raft to come along and make 'em rich again. Dey's mighty good to me, dese niggers is, and whatever I wants 'em to do for me, I don't have to ask 'em twice, honey. Dat Jack's a good nigger and pretty smart."
"Yes, he is. He ain't ever told me you was here. Told me to come, and he'd show me a lot of water moccasins. If anything happens, he ain't mixed up in it. He can say he never seen us together, and it'll be the truth." I don't want to talk much about the next day. I reckon I'll cut it pretty short. I waked up about dawn and was a-going to turn over and go to sleep again when I noticed how still it was. Didn't seem to be anybody stirring. That warn't usual. Next I noticed that Buck was up and gone. Well, I gets up a-wondering and goes downstairs. Nobody around. Everything as still as a mouse. Just the same outside. Thinks I, what does this mean? Down by the woodpile I comes across my Jack, and he says, "What's it all about?" Says he. "Don't you know, Mars George?" "No," says I don't. "Well, den, Miss Sophia's run off, deed she has. She run off in the night sometime, nobody don't know just when. Run off to get married to that young Honey Shepherdson, you know. Leastways so they spec. The family found out about half an hour ago, maybe a little more, and I tell you they want no time lost. Sich another hurrying up guns and horses you never see. The women folks has gone for to stir up their relations, and old Mars Saul and the boys tucked the guns and rode up the river road for to try to catch that young man and kill him before he can get across the river with Miss Sophia. I reckon they's going to be mighty rough times." Buck went off without waking me up. "Well, I reckon he did. They warn't going to mix you up in it. Mars Buck, he loaded up his gun and 'lowed he's going to fetch home a Shepherdson or bust. Well, there be plenty of 'em dar, I reckon, and you bet you he fetch one of 'em if he gets the chance." I took up the river road as hard as I could put. By and by I began to hear guns a good way off. When I come inside of the log store in the woodpile where the steamboats land, I worked along under the trees and brush till I got to a good place, and then I clumb up into the forks of a cottonwood that was out of reach and watched. There was a wood rank 4 foot high a little ways in front of the tree, and first I was going to hide behind that, but maybe it was luckier I didn't. There was 4 or 5 men cavorting around on their horses in the open place before the log store, cussing and yelling and trying to get at a couple of young chaps that was behind a wood rank along of the steamboat landing, but they couldn't come it. Every time one of them showed himself on the river side of the woodpile, he got shot at. The 2 boys was squatting back to back behind the pile so they could watch both ways. By and by, men stopped cavorting around and yelling. They started riding towards the shore, then up gets one of the boys, draws a steady bead over the wood rank, and drops one of 'em out of his saddle. All the men jumped off of their horses and grabbed the hurt one and started to carry him to the store, and that minute the 2 boys started on the run. They got halfway to the tree I was in before the men noticed. Then the men see 'em and jump on their horses and took out after 'em. They gained on the boys, but it didn't do no good. The boys had too good a start. They got to the woodpile that was in front of my tree and slipped in behind it, and so they had to bulge on the men again. One of the boys was Buck, and the other was a slim young chap about 19 years old. The men ripped around a while and then rode away. As soon as they was out of sight, I sung out to Buck and told him. He didn't know what to make of my voice coming out of the tree at first. He was awful surprised. He told me to watch out sharp and let him know when the men come in sight again. Said they was up to some devilment or other, wouldn't be gone long. I wished I was out of that tree, but I dasn't come down. Buck begun to cry and rip and lowed that him and his cousin Joe, that was the other young chap, would make up for this day yet. He said his father and his 2 brothers was killed, and 2 or 3 of the enemy. Said the Shepherdsons laid for them in ambush. Buck said his father and brothers ought to waited for their relations. The Shepherdsons was too strong for 'em. I asked him what was become of young Harney and Miss Sophia. He said they'd got across the river and was safe. I was glad of that, but the way Buck did take on because he didn't manage to kill Harney the day he shot at him, I ain't ever heard anything like it. All of a sudden, bang, bang, bang goes 3 or 4 guns. The men had slipped around through the woods and come in from behind without their horses. The boys jumped for the river, both of them hurt, and as they swum down the current, the men run along the bank shooting at him and singing out, "Kill him! Kill him!" It made me so sick I most fell out of the tree. I ain't a-going to tell all that happened. It would make me sick again if I was to do that. I wished I hadn't ever come ashore that night to see such things. I ain't ever going to shut of them. Lots of times I dream about them. I stayed in the tree till it begun to get dark, afraid to come down. Sometimes I heard guns way off in the woods, and twice I seen little gangs of men gallop past the log store with guns, so I reckon the trouble was still a-going on. I was mighty downhearted, so I made up my mind I wouldn't ever go near that house again, because I reckoned I was to blame somehow. I judged that that piece of paper meant that Miss Sophia was to meet Harney somewheres at 2:30 and run off, and I judged I ought to told her father about the paper and the curious way she acted, and then maybe he would 'a' locked her up, and this awful mess wouldn't ever happen. When I got down out of the tree, I crept along down the river bank a piece and found the 2 bodies laying in the edge of the water and tugged at them till I got them ashore. Then I covered up their faces and got away as quick as I could. I cried a little when I was covering up Buck's face, for he was mighty good to me. It was just dark now. I never went near the house, but struck through the woods and made for the swamp. Jim warn't on his island, so I tramped off in a hurry for the crick, and crowded through the willows red hot to jump aboard and get out of that awful country. The raft was gone. My souls, but I was scared. I couldn't get my breath for most a minute. Then I raised a yell. A voice not 25 foot from me says, "Good land, is that you, honey? Don't make no noise." It was Jim's voice. Nothing ever sounded so good before. I run along the bank a piece and got aboard, and Jim, he grabbed me and hugged me, he was so glad to see me. He says, "Laws bless you, child. I's right down sure you's dead again. Jack's been here, and he says he reckons you been shot 'cause you didn't come home no more. So I's just dis minute a-starting the raft down towards the mouth of the crick, so's to be all ready for to shove out and leave as soon as Jack comes again and tells me for certain you is dead. Lawsy, I's mighty glad to get you back again, honey." I says, "All right, that's mighty good. They won't find me, and they'll think I've been killed and floated down the river. Now, there's something up there that'll help 'em think so. So don't you lose no time, Jim, but just shove off for the big water as fast as ever you can." I never felt easy till the raft was 2 miles below there and out in the middle of the Mississippi. Then we hung up our signal lantern and judged that we was free and safe once more. I hadn't had a bite to eat since yesterday, so Jim, he got out some corn dodgers and buttermilk and pork and cabbages and greens. There ain't nothing in the world so good when it's cooked right. And whilst I ate my supper, we talked and had a good time. I was powerful glad to get away from the feuds, and so was Jim to get away from the swamp. We said there warn't no home like a raft after all. Other places do seem so cramped up and smothery, but a raft don't. You feel mighty free and easy and comfortable on a raft.
File 19.
Chapter 19. 2 or 3 days and nights went by. I reckon I might say they swum by. They slid along so quiet and smooth and lovely. Here is the way we put in the time. It was a monstrous big river down there, sometimes 1.5 miles wide. We run nights and laid up and hid daytimes. Soon as night was most gone, we stopped navigating and tied up, nearly always in the dead water under a towhead, and then cut young cottonwoods and willows and hid the raft with them. Then we set out the lines. Next we slid into the river and had a swim, so as to freshen up and cool off. Then we sat down on the sandy bottom where the water was about knee-deep and watched the daylight come. Not a sound anywheres, perfectly still, just like the whole world was asleep. Only sometimes the bullfrogs a-cluttering, maybe. The first thing to see, looking away over the water, was a kind of dull line. That was the woods on t'other side. You couldn't make nothing else out. Then a pale place in the sky, then more paleness spreading around. Then the river softened up a way off and warn't black any more, but gray. You could see little dark spots drifting along ever so far away. Trading scows and such things, and long black streaks, rafts. Sometimes you could hear a sweep screeking, or jumbled up voices. It was so still, and sounds come so far, and by you could see a streak on the water, which you know by the look of the streak that there's a snag there in a swift current, which breaks on it and makes that streak look that way. And you can see the mist curl up off of the water, and the east reddens up, and the river, and you make out a log cabin in the edge of the woods, away on the bank on t'other side of the river, being a wood yard likely, and piled by them cheats, so you can throw a dog through it anywheres. Then the nice breeze springs up and comes fanning you from over there, so cool and fresh and sweet to smell on account of the woods and the flowers. But sometimes not that way, because they've left dead fish laying around, gars and such, and they do get pretty rank. And next you've got the full day, and everything smiling in the sun, and the songbirds just going it. A little smoke couldn't be noticed now, so we would take some fish off of the lines and cook up a hot breakfast. And afterwards we would watch the lonesomeness of the river and kind of lazy along, and by lazy off to sleep. Wake up by and look to see what done it, and maybe see a steamboat coughing along upstream, so far off towards the other side you couldn't tell nothing about her, only whether she was a stern wheel or a side wheel. Then for about an hour there wouldn't be nothing to hear nor nothing to see, just solid lonesomeness. Next you'd see a raft sliding by, way off yonder, and maybe a galoot on it chopping, because they're most always doing it on a raft. You'd see the axe flash and come down. You don't hear nothing. You see that axe go up again, and by the time it's above the man's head, then you hear the ka-chunk, and it took all that time to come over the water. So we would put in the day lazying around, listening to the stillness. Once there was a thick fog, and the rafts and things that went by was beating tin pans so the steamboats wouldn't run over them. A scow or a raft went by so close we could hear them talking and cussing and laughing. Heard them plain, but we couldn't see no sign of them. It made you feel crawly. It was like spirits carrying on that way in the air. Jim said he believed it was spirits, but I says, "Naw, spirits wouldn't say durn the darn fog." Soon as it was night out, we shoved. When we got her out to about the middle, we let her alone, and let her float wherever the current wanted her to. Then we lit the pipes and dangled our legs in the water and talked about all kinds of things. We was always naked day and night, whenever the mosquitoes would let us. The new clothes Buck's folks made for me was too good to be comfortable, and besides, I didn't go much on clothes nohow. Sometimes we'd have that whole river all to ourselves for the longest time. Yonder was the banks and the islands across the water, and maybe a spark, which was a candle in a cabin window, and sometimes on the water you could see a spark or two, on a raft or a scow, you know, and maybe you could hear a fiddle or a song coming over from one of them crafts. It's lovely to live on a raft. We had the sky up there all speckled with stars, and we used to lay on our backs and look up at them, and discuss about whether they was made or only just happened. Jim said he allowed they was made, but I allowed they happened. I judged it would have took too long to make so many. Jim said the moon could have laid them. Well, that looked kind of reasonable, so I didn't say nothing against it, because I've seen a frog lay most as many, so of course it could be done. We used to watch the stars that fell, too, and see them streak down. Jim allowed they'd got spoiled and was hove out of the nest. Once or twice of a night we would see a steamboat slipping along in the dark, and now and then she would belch a whole world of sparks up out of her chimneys, and they would rain down in the river and look awful purty. Then she would turn a cover, and her eyes would wink out, and her powwow shut off, and leave the river still again. and by her waves would get to us a long time after she was gone, and joggle the raft a bit, and after that you wouldn't hear nothing, for you couldn't tell how long, except maybe frogs or something. After midnight the people on shore went to bed, and then for 2 or 3 hours the shore was black. No more sparks in the cabin windows. These sparks was our clock, the first one that showed again, meaning morning was coming, so we hunted a place to hide and tie up right away. One morning about daybreak I found a canoe and crossed over a chute to the main shore. It was only 200 yards, and paddled about a mile up a creek amongst the cypress woods to see if I couldn't get some berries. Just as I was passing a place where a kind of a cow path crossed the creek, here comes a couple of men tearing up the path as tight as they could foot it. I thought I was a goner, for whenever anybody was after anybody, I judged it was me, or maybe Jim. I was about to dig out from there in a hurry, but they was pretty close to me then and sung out and begged me to save their lives. Said they hadn't been doing nothing and was being chased for it. Said there was men and dogs a-comin'. They wanted to jump right in, but I says, "Don't you do it. I don't hear the dogs and horses yet. You've got time to crowd through the brush and get up to the crick a little ways. Then you take to the water and wade down to me and get in. That'll throw the dogs off the scent." They done it, and soon as they was aboard I lit out for our towhead, and in about 5 or 10 minutes we heard the dogs and the men away off shouting. We heard them come along towards the crick, but couldn't see them. They seemed to stop and fool around a while. Then, as we got further and further away all the time, we couldn't hardly hear them at all. By the time we had left a mile of woods behind us and struck the river, everything was quiet, and we paddled over to the towhead and hid in the cottonwoods and was safe. One of these fellows was about 70 or upwards, and had a bald head and very gray whiskers. He had an old battered-up slouch hat on, and a greasy blue woolen shirt, and ragged old blue jeans breeches stuffed into his boot tops, and home-knit galluses. Nah, he only had one. He had an old long-tailed blue jeans coat with slick brass buttons flung over his arm, and both of them had big, fat, ratty-looking carpet bags. The other fellow was about 30 and dressed up about as ornery. After breakfast we all laid off and talked, and the first thing that come out was that these chaps didn't know one another. "What got you into trouble?" says the bald head to t'other chap. "Well, I've been selling an article to take the tartar off the teeth, and it does take it off, too, and generally the enamel along with it. But I stayed about one night longer than I ought to, and was just in the act of sliding out when I ran across you on the trail this side of town, and you told me they were coming and begged me to help you to get off. So I told you I was expecting trouble myself, and would scatter out with you. That's the whole yarn. What's yourn?" "Well, I've been running a little temperance revival there about a week, and was the pet of the women folks, big and little, for I was making it mighty warm for the rummies, I tell you, and taking as much as $5 or $6 a night, 10 cents a head, children and niggers free, and business a-growing all the time, when somehow or another a little report got around last night that I had a way of putting in my time with a private jug on the sly. A nigger rousted me out this morning and told me the people was gathering on the quiet with their dogs and horses, and they'd be along pretty soon and give me about half an hour's start, and then run me down if they could, and if they got me they'd tar and feather me and ride me on a rail sure. I didn't wait for no breakfast. I warn't hungry." "Old man," says the young one, "I reckon we might double-team it together. What do you think?" "I ain't undisposed. What's your line, mainly?" "Jaw print by trade. Do a little in patent medicines. Theater actor, tragedy, you know. Take a turn to mesmerism and phrenology when there's a chance. Teach singing geography school for a change. Sling a lecture sometimes. Oh, I do a lot of things. Most anything that comes handy, so it ain't work. What's your lay?" "I've done considerable in the doctoring way in my time. Laying on of hands is my best hold. For cancer and paralysis and sich things, and I can tell a fortune pretty good when I got somebody along to find out the facts for me. Preachin's my line, too, and working camp meetings and missionarying around." Nobody never said anything for a while. Then the young man hove a sigh and says, "Alas." "What are you lassing about?" said the bald head. "To think I should have lived to be leading such a life and be degraded down into such company." And he begun to wipe the corner of his eye with a rag. "Durn your skin, ain't the company good enough for you?" says the bald head, purty pert and uppish. "Yes, it is good enough for me. It's as good as I deserve, for who fetched me so low when I was so high? I did myself. I don't blame you, gentlemen, far from it. I don't blame anybody. I deserve it all. Let the cold world do its worst. One thing I know, there's a grave somewhere for me. The world may go on just as it's always done and take everything from me, loved ones, property, everything, but it can't take that. Some day I'll lie down in it and forget it all, and my poor broken heart will be at rest." He went on a-wiping. "Drot your poor broken heart," said the bald head. "What are you heaving your poor broken heart at us for? We hain't done nothing." "No, I know you haven't. I ain't blaming you, gentlemen. I brought myself down, yes, I did it myself. It's right I should suffer, perfectly right. I don't make any moan." "Brought you down from whar? Whar was you brought down from?" "Ah, you would not believe me. The world never believes. Let it pass, 'tis no matter. The secret of my birth." "The secret of your birth? Do you mean to say—" "Gentlemen," says the young man, very solemn, "I will reveal it to you, for I feel I may have confidence in you. By rights, I am a duke." Jim's eyes bugged out when he heard that, and I reckon mine did too. Then the bald head says, "Nah, you can't mean it." "Yes, my great-grandfather, eldest son of the Duke of Bridgewater, fled to this country about the end of the last century, to breathe the pure air of freedom, married here and died, leaving a son, his own father dying about the same time. The second son of the late Duke seized the title and estates. The infant real Duke was ignored. I am the lineal descendant of that infant. I am the rightful Duke of Bridgewater, and here I am, forlorn, torn from my high estate, hunted of men, despised by the cold world, ragged, worn, heartbroken, and degraded to the companionship of felons on a raft." Jim pitied him ever so much, and so did I. We tried to comfort him, but he said it warn't much use. He couldn't be much comforted. Said if we was a mind to acknowledge him, that would do him more good than most anything else. So we said we would, if he would tell us how. He said we ought to bow when we spoke to him and say, "Your Grace," or "My Lord," or "Your Lordship," and he wouldn't mind it if we called him plain Bridgewater, which he said was a title anyway and not a name, and one of us ought to wait on him at dinner and do any little thing for him he wanted done. Well, that was all easy, so we done it. All through dinner Jim stood around and waited on him and says, "Will your Grace have some of this or some of that?" and so on, and a body could see it was mighty pleasing to him. But the old man got pretty silent by and by, didn't have much to say, and didn't look pretty comfortable over all that petting that was going on around that Duke. He seemed to have something on his mind. So along in the afternoon he says, "Looky here, Bilgewater," he says, "I'm nation sorry for you, but you ain't the only person that has troubles like that." "No? No, you ain't. You ain't the only person that's been snaked down wrongfully out in a high place." "Alas." "No, you ain't the only person that's had a secret of his high birth." And by jings, he begins to cry. "Oh, what do you mean?" "Bilgewater, can I trust you?" says the old man, still sort of sobbing. "To the bitter death." He took the old man by the hand and squeezed it and says, "That secret of your being, speak." "Bilgewater, I am the late Dauphin." You betcha Jim and me stared this time. Then the Duke says, "You are what?" Yes, my friend, it is too true. Your eyes is looking at this very moment on the poor disappearing Dauphin, Louis the 17th, son of Louis the 16th and Mary Antoinette.
You, at your age? No. You mean you're the late Charlemagne? You must be 600 or 700 years old at the very least.
Trouble has done it, Bilgewater. Trouble has done it. Trouble has brung these gray hairs and this premature balditude. Yes, gentlemen, you see before you, in blue jeans and misery, the wandering, exiled, trampled on, and suffering rightful King of France.
Well, he cried and took on so that me and Jim didn't hardly know what to do. We was so sorry, and so glad and proud we got him with us, too. So we set in like we done before with the Duke and tried to comfort him. But he said it warn't no use, nothing but to be dead and done with it all could do him any good, though he said it often made him feel easier and better for a while if people treated him according to his rights, and got down on one knee to speak to him and always called him Your Majesty, and waited on him first at meals and didn't set down in his presence till he asked them. So Jim and me set to majestying him, and doing this and that and t'other for him, and standing up till he told us we might set down. This done him heaps of good, and so he got cheerful and comfortable, but the Duke kind of soured on him, and didn't look a bit satisfied with the way things was going. Still, the king acted real friendly towards him, and said the Duke's great-grandfather and all the other Dukes of Bilgewater was a good deal thought of by his father, and was allowed to come to the palace considerable. But the Duke stayed huffy a good while, till by and by the king says, "Like as not we got to be together a blame long time on this here raft, Bilgewater, and so what's the use of your being sour? It'll only make things uncomfortable. It ain't my fault I warn't born a duke, and it ain't your fault you warn't born a king, so what's the use to worry? Make the best of things the way you find 'em, says I. That's my motto. This ain't no bad thing that we've struck here. Plenty grub and an easy life. Come, give us your hand, Duke, and let's all be friends." The Duke done it, and Jim and me was pretty glad to see it. It took away all the uncomfortableness, and we felt mighty good over it, because it would have been miserable business to have any unfriendliness on the raft. For what you want above all things on a raft is for everybody to be satisfied and feel right and kind towards the others. It didn't take me long to make up my mind that these liars weren't no kings nor dukes at all, but just low-down humbugs and frauds. But I never said nothing, never let on, kept it myself. It's the best way. Then you don't have no quarrels and don't get into no trouble. If they wanted us to call them kings and dukes, I hadn't no objections, long as it would keep peace in the family, and it warn't no use to tell Jim, so I didn't tell him. If I never learnt nothing else out of Pap, I learnt that the best way to get along with his kind of people is to let them have their own way.
File 20.
Chapter 20. They asked us considerable many questions, wanted to know what we covered up the raft that way for and laid by in the daytime instead of running. Was Jim a runaway nigger? Says I, "Goodness sakes, would a runaway nigger run south?" No, they allowed he wouldn't. I had to account for things some way, so I says, "My folks was living in Pike County in Missouri where I was born, and they all died off but me and Pa and my brother Ike. Pa, he allowed he'd break up and go down and live with Uncle Ben, who's got a little one-horse place on the river, 44 mile below Orleans. Pa was pretty poor and had some debt, so when he squared up there warn't nothing left but $16 in our nigger Jim. That warn't enough to take us 1,400 mile, deck passage nor no other way. Well, when the river rose, Pa had a streak of luck one day. He catched this piece of a raft, so we reckoned we'd go down to Orleans on it. Pa's luck didn't hold out. A steamboat run over the forward corner of the raft one night, and we all went overboard and dove under the wheel. Jim and me come up all right, but Pa was drunk, and Ike was only 4 years old, so they never come up no more. Well, for the next day or two we had considerable trouble because people was always coming out in skiffs and trying to take Jim away from me, saying they believed he was a runaway nigger. We don't run daytimes no more now. Nights, they don't bother us. The Duke says,
Leave me alone to cipher out a way so we can run in the daytime if we want to. I'll think the thing over. I'll invent a plan that'll fix it. We'll let it alone for today because of course we don't want to go by that town yonder in daylight. It mightn't be healthy.
Towards night it begun to darken up and look like rain. The heat lightning was squirting around low down in the sky, and the leaves was beginning to shiver. It was going to be pretty ugly, it was easy to see that. So the Duke and the King went to overhauling our wigwam, to see what the beds was like. My bed was a straw tick, and better than Jim's, which was a corn shuck tick. There's always cobs around about in a shuck tick, and they poke into you and hurt you. And when you roll over, the dry shucks sound like you was rolling over in a pile of dead leaves. It makes such a rustling that you wake up. Well, the Duke allowed he would take my bed, but the King allowed he wouldn't. He says, I should have reckoned the difference in rank would have suggested to you that a corn shuck bed warn't just fitting for me to sleep on. Your Grace'll take the shuck bed yourself. Jim and me was in a sweat again for a minute, being afraid there was going to be some more trouble amongst them. So we was pretty glad when the Duke says,
"'Tis my fate to be always ground into the mire under the iron heel of oppression. Misfortune has brought my once haughty spirit. I yield, I submit, 'tis my fate. I am alone in the world. Let me suffer, can bear it."
We got away as soon as it was good and dark. The King told us to stand well out towards the middle of the river, and not to show a light till we got a long ways below the town. We come inside of the little bunch of lights by and by, that was the town, you know, and slid by about half a mile out all right. When we was 3/4 of a mile below, we hoisted up our signal lantern, and about 10 o'clock it come on to rain and blow and thunder and lightning like everything. So the King told us both to stay on watch till the weather got better. Then him and the Duke crawled into the wigwam and turned in for the night. It was my watch below till 12, but I wouldn't have turned in anyway if I'd had a bed, because a body don't see such a storm as that every day in the week, not by a long sight. My souls, how the wind did scream along, and every second or two there'd come a glare that lit up the whitecaps for half a mile around, and you'd see the islands looking dusty through the rain, and the trees thrashing around in the wind. Then comes a whack, boom, 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 and the thunder would go rumbling and grumbling away and quit, and then rip comes another flash and another sockdolager. The waves most washed me off the raft sometimes, but I hadn't any clothes on and didn't mind. We didn't have no trouble about snags. The lightning was glaring and flittering around so constant that we could see them pretty soon enough to throw her head this way or that and miss 'em. I had the middle watch, you know, but I was pretty sleepy by that time, so Jim said he would stand the first half of it for me. He was always mighty good that way, Jim was. I crawled into the wigwam, but the King and the Duke had their legs sprawled around, so there warn't no show for me, so I laid outside. I didn't mind the rain because it was warm, and the waves warn't running so high now. About 2 they come up again, though, and Jim was going to call me, but he changed his mind, because he reckoned they warn't high enough yet to do any harm. But he was mistaken about that, for pretty soon, all of a sudden, along comes a regular ripper and washed me overboard. It most killed Jim a-laughing. He was the easiest nigger to laugh that ever was, anyway. I took the watch, and Jim he laid down and snored away, and by the storm let up for good and all, and the first cabin light that showed I rousted him out, and we slid the raft into hiding quarters for the day. The King got out an old ratty deck of cards after breakfast, and him and the Duke played 7-up a while, 5 cents a game. Then they got tired of it and allowed they would lay out a campaign, as they called it. The Duke went down into his carpet bag and fetched up a lot of little printed bills and read them aloud. One bill said, The celebrated Dr. Armand de Montalban of Paris would lecture on the science of phrenology at such and such a place on a blank day of blank at 10 cents admission, and furnished charts of character at 25 cents apiece. The Duke said that was him. In another bill he was the world-renowned Shakespearean tragedian Garrick the Younger of Drury Lane, London. In other bills he had a lot of other names and done other wonderful things, like finding water and gold with a divining rod, dissipating witch spells, and so on. By and by he says,
"But the histrionic muse is the darling. Have you ever trod the boards, royalty?"
"No," says the king.
"You shall, then, before you're 3 days older, fallen grandeur," says the Duke. "The first good town we come to, we'll hire a hall and do the sword fight in Richard III, and the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet. How does that strike you?"
"I'm in up to the hub for anything that will pay, Bilgewater. But you see, I don't know nothing about play acting, and hain't never seen much of it. I was too small when Pap used to have 'em at the palace. Do you reckon you can learn me?"
"Easy."
"All right, I'm just a-freezing for something fresh anyway. Let's commence right away."
So the Duke he told him all about who Romeo was and who Juliet was, and said he was used to being Romeo so the king could be Juliet.
"But if Juliet's such a young gal, Duke, my peeled head and my white whiskers is going to look oncommon odd on her, maybe."
"No, don't you worry. These country jakes won't ever think of that. Besides, you know, you'll be in costume, and that makes all the difference in the world. Juliet's in a balcony enjoying the moonlight before she goes to bed, and she's got on her nightgown and her ruffled nightcap. Here are the costumes for the parts."
He got out 2 or 3 curtain calico suits, which he said was medieval armor for Richard III, and t'other chap in a long white cotton nightshirt and a ruffled nightcap to match. The king was satisfied, so the Duke got out his book and read the parts over in the most splendid spread-eagle way, prancing around and acting at the same time to show how it had got to be done. Then he give the book to the king and told him to get his part by heart. There was a little one-horse town about 3 mile down the bend, and after dinner the Duke said he had ciphered out his idea about how to run in daylight without it being dangersome for Jim, so he allowed he would go down to the town and fix that thing. The king allowed he would go too and see if he couldn't strike something. We was out of coffee, so Jim says I better go along with him in the canoe and get some. When we got there warn't nobody stirring, streets empty and perfectly dead and still like Sunday. We found a sick nigger sunning himself in a backyard, and he said everybody that warn't too young or too sick or too old was gone to camp meeting, about 2 mile back in the woods. The king got the directions and allowed he'd go and work that camp meeting for all it was worth, and I might go too. The Duke said what he was after was a printing office. We found it, a little bit of a concern, up over a carpenter shop. Carpenters and printers all gone to the meeting, and no doors locked. It was a dirty, littered-up place and had ink marks and handbills with pictures of horses and runaway niggers on them, all over the walls. The Duke shed his coat and said he was all right now, so me and the king lit out for the camp meeting. We got there in about half an hour, fairly dripping, for it was a most awful hot day. There was as much as 1,000 people there from 20 mile around. The woods was full of teams and wagons hitched everywheres, feeding out of the wagon troughs and stomping to keep off the flies. There was sheds made out of poles and roofed over with branches, where they had lemonade and gingerbread to sell and piles of watermelons and green corn and such like truck. The preaching was going on under the same kinds of sheds, only they was bigger and held crowds of people. The benches was made out of outside slabs of logs with holes bored in the round side to drive sticks into for the legs. They didn't have no backs. The preachers had high platforms to stand on at one end of the sheds. The women had on sunbonnets, and some had linsey-woolsey frocks, some gingham ones, and a few of the young ones had on calico. Some of the young men was barefooted, and some of the children didn't have on any clothes but just a tow linen shirt. Some of the old women was knitting, and some of the young folks was courting on the sly. The first shed we come to, the preacher was lining out a hymn. He lined out 2 lines, everybody sung it, and it was kind of grand to hear it. There was so many of them, and they done it in such a rousing way. Then he lined out 2 more for them to sing, and so on. The people woke up more and more and sung louder and louder, and towards the end some begun to groan and some begun to shout. Then the preacher begun to preach, and begun in earnest too, and went weaving first to one side of the platform and then the other, and then a-leaning down over the front of it with his arms and his body going all the time, and shouting his words out with all his might, and every now and then he would hold up his Bible and spread it open, and kind of pass it around this way and that, shouting, "It's the brazen serpent in the wilderness, look upon it and live." And the people would shout out, "Glory, amen." And so he went on, and the people groaning and crying and saying amen. "Oh, come to the mourner's bench, come black with sin, amen. Come sick and sore, amen. Come lame and halt and blind, amen. Come poor and needy, sunk in shame, amen. Come all that's worn and soiled and suffering, come with a broken spirit, come with a contrite heart, come in your rags and sin and dirt. The waters that cleanse is free, the door of heaven stands open. Oh, enter in and be at rest. Amen, glory, glory, hallelujah." And so on. You couldn't make out what the preacher said anymore on account of the shouting and crying. Folks got up everywheres in the crowd and worked their way just by main strength to the mourner's bench, with the tears running down their faces, and when all the mourners had got up there to the front benches in a crowd, they sung and shouted and flung themselves down on the straw, just crazy and wild. Well, the first I knowed the king got a-going, and you could hear him over everybody, and next he went a-charging up onto the platform, and the preacher he begged him to speak to the people, and he done it. He told them he was a pirate, been a pirate for 30 years out in the Indian Ocean, and his crew was thinned out considerable last spring in a fight, and he was home now to take out some fresh men, and thanks to goodness he'd been robbed last night and put ashore off of a steamboat without a cent, and he was glad of it. It was the blessedest thing that ever happened to him, because he was a changed man now, and happy for the first time in his life, and poor as he was going to start right off and work his way back to the Indian Ocean and put in the rest of his life trying to turn the pirates into the true path, for he could do it better than anybody else, being acquainted with all the pirate crews in that ocean. And though it would take him a long time to get there without money, he would get there anyway, and every time he convinced a pirate, he would say to him, "Don't you thank me, don't you give me no credit. It all belongs to them dear people in Pokeville camp meeting, natural brothers and benefactors of the race, and that dear preacher there, the truest friend a pirate ever had." And then he busted into tears, and so did everybody. Then somebody sings out, "Take up a collection for him! Take up a collection!" Well, a half a dozen made a jump to do it, but somebody sings out, "Let him pass the hat around!" Then everybody said it, and the preacher too. So the king went all through the crowd with his hat, swabbing his eyes and blessing the people and praising them and thanking them for being so good to the poor pirates away off there. And every little while the purtiest kind of girls, with the tears running down their cheeks, would up and ask him would he let them kiss him for to remember him by? And he always done it, and some of them he hugged and kissed as many as 5 or 6 times. And he was invited to stay a week, and everybody wanted him to live in their houses, and said they'd think it was an honor. But he said as this was the last day of the camp meeting, he couldn't do no good, And besides, he was in a sweat to get to the Indian Ocean right off and go to work on the pirates. When we got back to the raft and he come to count up, he found he had collected $87.75. And then he had fetched away a 3-gallon jug of whiskey, too, that he found under a wagon when he was starting home through the woods. The king said, take it all around, it laid over any day he'd ever put in the missionarying line. He said it warn't no use talking. Heathens don't amount to shucks alongside of pirates to work a camp meeting with. The Duke was thinking he'd been doing pretty well till the king come to show up, but after that he didn't think so much. He had set up and printed off 2 little jobs for farmers in that printing office, horse bills, and took the money, $4. And he had got in $10 worth of advertisements for the paper, which he had said he would put in for $4 if they would pay in advance, so they done it. The price of the paper was $2 a year, but he took in 3 subscriptions for $50 apiece on condition of them paying him in advance. They were going to pay in cordwood and onions as usual, but he said he just bought the concern and knocked down the price as low as he could afford it, and was going to run it for cash. He set up a little piece of poetry which he made himself out of his own head, 3 verses, kind of sweet and saddish. The name of it was, Yes, Crush Cold World This Breaking Heart. And he left that all set up and ready to print in the paper and didn't charge nothing for it. Well, he took in $9.50 and said he'd done a pretty square day's work for it. Then he showed us another little job he'd printed and hadn't charged for because it was for us. It had a picture of a runaway nigger with a bundle on a stick over his shoulder and $200 reward under it. The reading was all about Jim and just described him to a dot. It said he run away from St. Jacques Plantation, 45 miles below New Orleans last winter, and likely went north, and whoever would catch him and send him back, he could have the reward and expenses.
Now, says the Duke, after tonight we can run in the daytime if we want to. Whenever we see anybody coming, we can tie Jim hand and foot with a rope, and lay him in the wigwam and show this handbill and say we captured him up the river. And we're too poor to travel on a steamboat, so we got this little raft on credit from our friends and are going down to get the reward. Handcuffs and chains would look still better on Jim, but it wouldn't go well with the story of us being so poor. Too much like jewelry. Ropes are the correct thing. We must preserve the unities, as we say on the boards.
We all said the Duke was pretty smart, and there couldn't be no trouble about running daytimes. We judged we could make miles enough that night to get out of the reach of the powwow we reckoned the Duke's work in the printing office was going to make in that little town. Then we could boom right along if we wanted to. We laid low and kept still and never shoved out till nearly 10 o'clock. Then we slid by pretty wide away from the town and didn't hoist our lantern till we was clear out of sight of it. When Jim called me to take the watch at 4 in the morning, he says,
Huck, does you reckon we gwine to run across any more kings on this trip?
No, I says, I reckon not.
Well, says he, that's all right then. I don't mind 1 or 2 kings, but that's enough. This one's powerful drunk and the Duke ain't much better.
I found Jim had been trying to get him to talk French so he could hear what it was like. But he said he had been in this country so long and had so much trouble he'd forgot it.